It was early autumn when the unsettling event unfolded, and to this day, the memory still sends chills down my spine. I was a senior in high school, attending a mid-sized public school in a quiet suburban area. The school was typical: beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and an air of monotony. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there, or so I thought. That particular day had started like any other. I was sitting in my third period biology class, half listening to Mr. Hayes explain mitosis while doodling aimlessly in my notebook. Around 20 minutes before the bell, I asked for a hall pass to use the restroom. My teacher, distracted by a student's question, waved me off without a second glance. The restroom was located at the far end of a hallway adjacent to the science wing. As I walked, I noticed how eerily quiet the halls were. The silence seemed thicker than usual, amplifying the sound of my footsteps on the tiled floor. Reaching the restroom, I pushed open the door, grateful for the solitude. I was mid-wash at the sink when the sound of the restroom door creaking open froze me. "Anyone in here?" A voice, low and flat, echoed off the tiled walls. It wasn't a teacher's voice. For a moment, I debated answering, but instinct told me to remain silent. The door creaked shut again, and I exhaled, assuming whoever it was had left. Still, the encounter felt off. The school intercom buzzed suddenly, cutting through the stillness. "Attention students and staff, we are initiating a lockdown. This is not a drill." My heart skipped. Lockdowns weren't rare. We had drills every semester. But the fact that this wasn't practice made me nervous. My immediate thought was to return to class, but something made me hesitate. What if the lockdown and the strange voice were connected? I decided to leave the restroom cautiously. Peeking into the hallway, I saw no one. The quiet had become oppressive, every step I took echoing far too loudly. As I approached the intersection of two hallways, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. My stomach sank. Someone was there. I quickened my pace, turning the corner sharply, but the footsteps followed, matching my speed. Whoever it was wasn't calling out, and that terrified me more than anything. I reached a set of lockers and ducked behind them, pressing my back against the cool metal. The footsteps paused, just around the corner, and then silence. Whoever it was had stopped walking. Were they waiting for me to move? The thought made my chest tighten. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to peek around the edge of the lockers. The hallway was empty. I exhaled shakily and began to move again, determined to reach my classroom. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow stretched across the floor ahead, cast by someone standing just out of sight around the next corner. The figure wasn't moving. It was just waiting. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. Spinning on my heel, I sprinted in the opposite direction, down the hall and through a set of double doors that led to the old and used wing of the school. The heavy doors slammed shut behind me, and I leaned against them, gasping for breath. It was then I realized my mistake. The old wing was rarely used, and there were no classrooms in session there. The halls were dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent bulbs above casting eerie shadows on the cracked linoleum floors. Worse, the only exit was on the far end of the wing. As I stood there, trying to gather my thoughts, I heard the doors creak open behind me. Someone had followed me. The faint creak of the doors opening behind me felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively pressed myself against the wall, willing the shadows to swallow me. The footsteps returned, slow and deliberate, echoing down the empty corridor. Whoever was following me wasn't in a hurry, as if they knew there was nowhere for me to run. I glanced around, searching for any potential hiding spots. To my left, a janitor's closet stood ajar. Without thinking, I slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could. The darkness enveloped me, and the faint smell of cleaning supplies stung my nose. I crouched low, trying to steady my breathing, but my heart was pounding so loudly I feared it might give me away. Through the thin gap between the door and its frame, I could see the hallway bathed in dim, flickering light. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped just outside the closet door. I froze, clamping a hand over my mouth. The person on the other side stood there for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't see their face, just the shadow they cast under the door. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My stomach lurched. I pressed myself further into the shadows, my body trembling. The door opened an inch, then another, and I caught a glimpse of a hand, calloused and pale, gripping the edge of the door. Suddenly, there was a noise in the distance. A loud thud, like something heavy falling to the ground. The hand froze, and the person hesitated. A second thud echoed down the hall. The figure let go of the door, stepping back. I could see their shadow shift as they turned toward the sound. Then, without warning, they walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement. When I was sure they were gone, I slowly opened the closet door, peeking out into the hallway. It was empty again, the dim light making it feel more like a haunted house than a school. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I had to find my way back to the main part of the school, to safety. I crept down the hallway, keeping close to the wall and listening for any sign of movement. As I neared the far end of the wing, I noticed something strange. One of the classroom doors was ajar, and light spilled out into the hallway. Curiosity battled with fear, but I needed to know if it was safe to proceed. I inched closer, peering through the gap. Inside, I saw a desk overturned, papers scattered across the floor. The room was empty, but something about the scene felt wrong. Then I saw it, a small, handwritten note pinned to the wall. The words, scrawled in shaky handwriting, sent a chill down my spine. "You can't run forever." The sound of a door slamming shut down the hall snapped me out of my shock. The footsteps were back, faster this time. I turned and ran, not caring how much noise I made. I burst through the door at the end of the wing, back into the main part of the school. The lights here were brighter, the hallways wider, but it still felt suffocatingly empty. I needed to find a teacher, a staff member, anyone who could help. As I rounded a corner, I collided with someone. My scream caught in my throat until I realized it was Officer Michaels, the school's resource officer. Relief flooded through me, and I blurted out everything that had happened. His face hardened as he listened. He radioed for backup, telling me to stay close. Together, we moved cautiously through the halls, searching for the intruder. It wasn't long before we heard a commotion coming from the old wing. Michaels drew his taser, signaling for me to stay back. I watched as he disappeared through the door, his footsteps fading into the distance. Then, silence. Minutes passed, and my anxiety grew. Suddenly, Michaels returned, his expression grim. He told me they'd found someone, a man in his late 30s who had somehow slipped onto campus during the morning rush. He was unarmed but had been lurking around the school for hours, moving between empty classrooms and avoiding detection. When the police searched the janitor's closet, they found something chilling. A notebook filled with pages of incoherent scribbles, including my name. To this day, I don't know how the man knew who I was or why he seemed so fixated on me. The school tightened its security after the incident, but the memory of that day still haunts me. I'll never forget the way those footsteps followed me, or the message on the wall. A grim reminder that sometimes, the worst nightmares are the ones that feel all too real. It was late winter, and the days were cold, gray, and short. I was in my final year of high school, and though graduation was around the corner, I felt suffocated by the monotony of my daily routine. The only solace I found was in the school library. It wasn't much, a modest space with rows of aging books and creaky wooden tables, but it was quiet, and it gave me a break from the noise of the crowded hallways. That particular week, I had started staying late after school to work on a research paper for my history class. My teacher had encouraged us to use physical sources rather than rely solely on the internet. So I spent hours in the library, thumbing through dusty books and flipping through ancient magazines. On the third evening of staying late, something shifted. I had arrived around 4 p.m., right after school let out, and settled into my usual spot in the far corner of the library. It was a cozy nook near the windows, where I could see the fading sunlight stretch across the campus lawn. The librarian, Mrs. O'Connor, gave me a nod as I passed her desk. "Don't stay too late," she said with a warm smile. "I won't," I promised. The hours passed in a blur of notes and cross-referencing. By the time I looked up, the windows were dark, reflecting the dim, flickering lights of the library. A quick glance at the clock told me it was nearly 7 p.m. Most of the staff had gone home by then, and the library had grown eerily silent. I began packing up my things when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the far wall. At first, I thought it was Mrs. O'Connor, but when I turned to look, no one was there. The library was still. I shrugged it off, blaming my exhaustion. I had been reading non-stop for hours, and my eyes were strained. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. I told myself it was nothing and headed toward the exit. As I passed the rows of shelves, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like fingers brushing against paper. I froze, scanning the dim aisles for movement. Mrs. O'Connor? I called out hesitantly. No response. The rustling stopped. I quickened my pace, my backpack bouncing against my shoulder. By the time I reached the door, my heart was racing. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it didn't budge. Locked. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind. I tugged on the door again, harder this time, but it was no use. The library was sealed shut, and Mrs. O'Connor was nowhere to be found. The intercom crackled suddenly, startling me. The principal's voice echoed through the empty halls. Attention staff and students. The school is now under lockdown. This is not a drill. The words sent a shiver down my spine. A lockdown? At this hour? I turned back toward the library's main desk, hoping to find Mrs. O'Connor or at least a key to the door. As I walked, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The shelves seemed taller and darker, the books casting elongated shadows that danced across the floor. I reached the desk, but it was empty. Mrs. O'Connor's coat and purse were gone, as if she had left in a hurry. Confused and scared, I decided to hide. Whatever had triggered the lockdown couldn't be good, and being out in the open felt like a mistake. I ducked behind the circulation desk, crouching low and trying to quiet my breathing. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an intruder? A drill gone wrong? I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen showed no signal, typical for our outdated school building. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing through the aisles. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was faint but unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly, as if searching for something or someone. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. I held my breath, willing myself to disappear. The moments stretched endlessly, my ears straining for any sign of movement. Suddenly, there was a sharp, metallic scrape, like nails dragging across a chalkboard. It came from the far side of the library, and the sound made my skin crawl. My eyes darted to the rows of shelves, half expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows. Nothing. The scrape came again, louder this time. It was closer. I pressed myself against the desk, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away. Then I saw it, a shadow moving across the floor, long and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't walking. It was slinking, dragging itself closer to where I hid. My blood turned to ice. The scraping sound stopped abruptly, and the shadow disappeared. For a brief, horrifying moment, everything was silent. Then, from directly above me, came a whisper, soft and breathy, almost playful. "Found you." My breath caught in my throat as the whisper lingered in the still air. I wanted to scream, but terror locked my voice deep in my chest. Slowly, I looked up, praying I wouldn't see anything. But what I saw was worse than I could have imagined. A face, pale and distorted, peered over the edge of the circulation desk. Its features were wrong, almost human but stretched in unnatural ways. Dark, sunken eyes stared at me, glinting with a cold intelligence. I bolted. Before I could think, I scrambled out from behind the desk and ran toward the back of the library. My heart thundered in my chest, and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard the scrape of something dragging across the floor, followed by the faintest hint of laughter. It wasn't the laughter of a person. I ducked between the bookshelves, weaving through the maze of rows in an attempt to lose whatever was chasing me. The dim lighting flickered erratically, casting shifting shadows that made it impossible to tell what was real and what was in my head. The scraping sound grew louder, echoing unnaturally in the confined space. I turned down another aisle, gasping for breath, and froze when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end, shrouded in darkness. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its gaze burning into me. Slowly, the figure tilted its head, as if curious about my presence. I took a shaky step back, and the figure mirrored my movement, gliding forward without lifting its feet. That was all it took. I turned and sprinted toward the back door of the library, where the emergency exit was located. My shoes squeaked against the linoleum as I ran, and every step felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. When I reached the emergency exit, I slammed into it with all my weight, but the door didn't budge. Panic surged through me as I tugged at the handle, but it was locked tight. A soft whisper drifted through the air behind me. Nowhere to run. I spun around, pressing my back against the door, and saw the figure again. It was closer this time, its elongated limbs twitching as it moved. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "Stay away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The figure didn't stop. It reached out one impossibly long arm, its fingers curling like claws. In a desperate bid for survival, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book from a nearby shelf, and hurled it at the figure. It hit with a dull thud, and for a moment, the thing recoiled, its shape flickering like static on an old TV screen. I didn't waste a second. Turning back to the door, I searched frantically for the emergency release bar. My fingers fumbled across the cold metal until I found a small lever. With all my strength, I yanked it down, and the door finally gave way. The cold night air hit me like a wave as I stumbled outside, collapsing onto the concrete steps. I looked back, expecting to see the figure chasing me, but the doorway was empty. The library was silent. I didn't stop running until I reached the front of the school, where I found a small group of teachers and the school resource officer. They were huddled together, their faces tense. When they saw me, they rushed over, bombarding me with questions. I told them everything: the lockdown, the locked doors, the thing that had been following me. At first, they seemed skeptical, but their doubt faded when they saw the look in my eyes. They escorted me to the principal's office, where I waited with the officer while the building was searched. Several long, agonizing hours passed before they told me what they had found. The library was empty. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone hiding there. But on the circulation desk, they discovered something strange: a single book, left open to a page about local folklore. The page described a shadowy entity said to haunt forgotten places, drawn to fear and isolation. I never went back to that library after dark again. The school tightened its security protocols, but no one ever explained the lockdown that night, or why I had been locked inside. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in the library. Was it real? A trick of my overworked mind? Or something else entirely? All I know is that the whisper still echoes in my nightmares, and I'll never forget the way it said, "Found you." It was a warm spring evening, and the fading sunlight bathed the school grounds in an amber glow. I was working late on an art project in the school's multipurpose room, a spacious area lined with colorful murals, paint-splattered tables, and racks of unfinished student work. I had always loved staying late when the school was nearly empty. It gave me time to focus, uninterrupted. By the time I glanced at the clock, it was already 7:15 p.m. The halls were silent, save for the occasional hum of the janitor's vacuum in the distance. I knew I should head home soon. The school's main doors locked automatically at 8 p.m., and I didn't want to be stuck inside. Packing up my supplies, I decided to cut across the back of the school to save time. This route passed by the playground, which always felt strangely eerie at night. The equipment, once so lively during the day, seemed to take on a sinister stillness in the fading light. As I stepped outside, the cool evening breeze hit me. The playground loomed ahead, the swings swaying slightly in the wind. I walked briskly, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Then I saw him. A man was standing by the jungle gym, just barely visible in the dim light. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his silhouette sharp against the dusky sky. I slowed down, my heart beginning to race. At first, I thought it might be the janitor or someone from the school, but something about the way he stood, so still, so deliberate, felt wrong. He turned his head toward me. I froze. The distance between us was too great for me to make out his face, but I could feel his gaze, heavy and unyielding. For a moment, we both stood there, locked in an unspoken standoff. Then he started walking toward me. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. His steps were slow, measured, as if he had all the time in the world. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in, and I turned, breaking into a sprint. My footsteps pounded against the pavement as I bolted toward the school's rear entrance. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him still following, his pace quickening. I reached the door and yanked it open, slamming it shut behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled to lock it. Through the small glass window, I could see him standing just outside, his face obscured by shadow. He didn't try the handle or knock. He just stood there, watching. I backed away slowly, my breathing ragged. The long hallway stretched out before me, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I needed to find someone, anyone, but the school felt impossibly empty. As I turned the corner, the intercom crackled to life. The voice of the principal, calm yet firm, echoed through the halls. Attention, staff and students. The school is now under lockdown. This is not a drill. Panic set in. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I didn't want to be alone. I sprinted down the hallway, searching for an open classroom or office. Every door I tried was locked, and the eerie silence made my footsteps seem deafening. Then, from behind me, came the faint sound of footsteps. I stopped, my chest tightening. The sound was steady, unhurried, and it was coming closer. I turned, but the hallway was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. No response. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the empty corridor. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned a corner, hoping to find somewhere to hide. As I moved, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping into a nearby room. I froze, my stomach knotting with fear. Was it him? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't want to find out. I turned and ran, my only goal to get as far away as possible. The sound of footsteps returned, faster this time, echoing through the hall like a sinister rhythm. I ducked into a nearby stairwell, crouching low and pressing myself against the cold concrete wall. The footsteps stopped again. I held my breath, straining to hear anything that would tell me where he was. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Then, from somewhere nearby, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "You can't hide forever." The whisper hung in the air like a thread pulled too tight, ready to snap. My heart pounded as I pressed myself further into the shadowy corner of the stairwell. Whoever, or whatever, was following me wasn't just some random stranger. This felt calculated, deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. I strained to hear more, but the building had gone eerily silent. Even the faint hum of the lights seemed to have disappeared, leaving me in a suffocating void of quiet. I knew I couldn't stay in the stairwell forever. If he found me there, I'd have no way out. Cautiously, I peered around the corner of the stairwell. The hallway was dimly lit and empty, but that didn't mean I was alone. I stepped out, my sneakers barely making a sound on the polished floor. I decided to head for the main office. Surely someone there could help, or at least I could lock myself in until the lockdown was over. As I moved, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the building itself were alive, watching me. Every step I took felt slower, louder, more deliberate, like I was walking through molasses. I reached the corner of the hallway and froze. A figure was standing at the far end, near the double doors that led to the gym. His back was to me, but his posture was rigid, unnatural. He wasn't moving, just standing there, as though he were waiting for me to make the first move. I stepped back, my shoes squeaking against the floor, and the sound made him turn his head. Slowly, too slowly. It was like watching a mannequin come to life. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but what I could see sent a shiver down my spine. His grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too perfect. Before I could even think, he started walking toward me, his movements unnervingly smooth. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. My lungs burned as I sprinted down the hallway, past the lockers and classrooms, all of which were locked and dark. The sound of his footsteps followed me, deliberate and heavy, like he wasn't in a hurry, like he knew he didn't need to be. I turned another corner and spotted the door to the media center. Desperate, I tried the handle, and to my relief, it opened. I slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could and locking it behind me. The room was pitch dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the computer monitors scattered across the tables. I crouched behind one of the desks, trying to steady my breathing. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the monitors. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then, the handle on the door jiggled. My stomach dropped. I covered my mouth with both hands, suppressing the scream clawing its way up my throat. The jiggling stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across the wooden door. "Open up," came the voice, low and almost sing-song. It was playful, like someone coaxing a scared animal. "I just want to talk." I didn't move. The scratching continued, more insistent now. I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, searching for another exit. Then I saw it, a second door at the far end of the media center, leading to the adjoining tech lab. I didn't think. I crawled toward the door, keeping low and moving as quietly as I could. Behind me, the scratching stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I glanced back and saw the faint outline of a shadow through the frosted glass of the door. He was still there, waiting. I reached the second door and eased it open, slipping into the tech lab. It was even darker in here, the rows of computers casting strange, angular shadows on the walls. My only hope was the emergency exit at the far end of the room. As I crept toward it, a loud crash echoed behind me. My blood turned to ice. He had broken through the media center door. His footsteps were louder now, heavier, like he wasn't trying to stay quiet anymore. He knew where I was, and he was coming for me. I reached the emergency exit and pushed against the bar, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as I realized it was chained shut, probably a safety measure to keep students from sneaking out during the day. The footsteps grew closer, echoing off the walls of the tech lab. I turned to see his silhouette standing in the doorway, his head tilted in that same unnatural angle. "There's nowhere left to go," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Desperation took over. I grabbed a heavy monitor from one of the desks and hurled it at him. It hit him square in the chest, and he staggered back, letting out a guttural growl that didn't sound human. I took the opportunity to bolt past him, sprinting out of the tech lab and back into the hallway. My mind raced as I tried to think of where to go. Then, I remembered the janitor's office near the cafeteria. It had a phone and a security monitor. If I could get there, I could call for help. The hallway blurred as I ran, my legs burning and my lungs heaving. Behind me, the footsteps returned, faster now, almost frantic. He was chasing me, and he was close. I reached the janitor's office and threw myself inside, locking the door behind me. The room was cramped and cluttered with cleaning supplies, but it felt like a sanctuary. I grabbed the phone on the desk and dialed 911. My fingers trembling, the operator's calm voice answered, and I blurted out everything, my words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. She assured me that help was on the way, but I wasn't sure I could last that long. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. The operator's voice crackled in my ear. "Stay on the line," she said. "Officers are en route." The door rattled violently, and I screamed, backing into the corner of the room. The chain on the outside held firm, but I could hear him on the other side, whispering. "I'll find you again," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You can't hide forever." Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air, piercing through the silence like a beacon of hope. The rattling stopped, and I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. Moments later, the police arrived, bursting into the school and sweeping the area. They never found him. To this day, I don't know who or what he was. All I know is that he meant what he said. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the back of my mind. It was my senior year of high school, and things were generally pretty routine. Classes, football games, and late-night cram sessions filled my life. But one rainy October evening, my school's dull monotony was shattered by a series of events I still can't fully explain. It started with an announcement, simple yet ominous. Attention, students and staff. We are going into a lockdown. This is not a drill. It was the kind of announcement that sent chills down your spine. I was in the library at the time, tucked away at a corner table with a couple of classmates, trying to finish up a group project. The library was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. We exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. The librarian, an older woman who usually kept things calm, seemed unusually flustered as she hurried to lock the doors and shut off the lights. "What do you think's going on?" asked Jenna, one of my group mates. She had her phone out, but there were no texts or updates from anyone. "Probably just another drill," replied Dylan, though his voice wavered. None of us believed him. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging longer than the last. We whispered theories among ourselves, ranging from a suspicious person spotted near the school to a prank gone wrong. Then came the first sign that something wasn't right. A loud, metallic clang from the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. The librarian motioned for us to stay quiet, her face pale and tight with fear. But curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I crept toward the door to peek through the narrow window. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. At first, I saw nothing, just rows of lockers and the faint outline of the trophy case at the end of the corridor. Then I caught movement, a shadow, darting just out of sight around the corner. "I think someone's out there," I whispered, backing away from the door. Dylan and Jenna exchanged worried looks, but before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The librarian gestured for us to stay put and disappeared into her office, presumably to call for help. The rest of us huddled near the back of the library, our breaths shallow and hearts pounding. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. A shadow blocked out the faint light filtering through the window. Whoever it was tried the handle, rattling it loudly. Locked. Relief washed over me for a split second, until the rattling stopped and a soft, deliberate knock replaced it. Knock, knock, knock. We froze. Jenna stifled a gasp, and Dylan muttered something under his breath. The knocking continued, relentless and steady, as if whoever was out there knew we were inside and was daring us to respond. Suddenly, the librarian returned, a look of pure terror on her face. "Hide. Now," she whispered urgently. "Get down and stay quiet." She ushered us toward the back room, a small storage area lined with bookshelves and supply cabinets. As we scrambled inside, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of the rain outside. We waited, breathless and straining to hear any sound. Then, without warning, the doorknob turned. The doorknob twisted, slow and deliberate, as though whoever was on the other side wanted us to know they were there. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would give us away. The librarian motioned for us to stay low and silent as she positioned herself near the back room's door with a trembling hand on the lock. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. A heavy thud against the library door, and another. The pattern was irregular, like someone was ramming into it with their shoulder, trying to force their way in. The librarian muttered something under her breath, barely audible over the noise, and I realized she was praying. I turned to Dylan and Jenna, who were crouched behind a shelf with me. Dylan looked pale, clutching his phone like it was a lifeline. Jenna's eyes were wide with tears, threatening to spill over. I gestured for Dylan to call someone, but he shook his head and mouthed. No signal. The pounding stopped. For a moment, silence reigned, so absolute it was suffocating. Then, we heard it, the sound of something scraping against the door, like metal dragging across the wood. A chill ran down my spine. "What is that?" Jenna whispered, barely audible. I didn't have an answer, but my mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a weapon? A tool? Whoever was out there wasn't giving up. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by the faint creak of footsteps retreating down the hallway. The librarian motioned for us to stay put while she crept toward the door, her shoes silent on the carpeted floor. She peered through the small window, her face pale in the dim light. "It's clear," she whispered, though her voice shook. "But we need to stay here until the lockdown is lifted." Before any of us could respond, Dylan's phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced at the screen, his face lighting up briefly before darkening again. "It's my brother," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "He says there's a guy in the school. He's got a mask and something in his hand. He was spotted near the gym." The tension in the room thickened. The gym was on the other side of the building, but knowing the intruder's general location did little to ease our fears. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The rain outside picked up, the steady rhythm echoing faintly in the quiet room. Suddenly, the distant sound of glass shattering broke the silence. It wasn't close, but it was enough to make Jenna let out a muffled cry. "Quiet!" the librarian hissed, her voice as sharp as a blade. We all held our breath, listening intently. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed faintly, moving unpredictably from one end of the school to the other. Whoever this was, they weren't following any kind of pattern. It was like they were searching for something, or someone. Then came the sound of the library door being rattled again. My stomach twisted in knots. I could see the faint outline of a figure through the frosted glass. They stood motionless for what felt like forever, as though they were listening. Then, slowly, the shadow turned and disappeared. Just as I began to exhale, the door to the back room we were hiding in rattled violently. The intruder wasn't just outside the library anymore. They were inside. The librarian locked eyes with us, motioning for us to stay hidden as she stepped forward. There was no weapon in her hand, just sheer resolve in her eyes. She pressed herself against the door, trying to keep it shut, but the handle jiggled, then twisted sharply. Whoever was on the other side had strength and determination. I reached for a heavy bookend on the shelf beside me, my palms sweating as I prepared for the worst. Dylan and Jenna looked equally panicked, frozen in place. The door shuddered as the person outside rammed into it again and again. With each impact, the lock held, but I could see it straining. Then, the pounding stopped abruptly. We waited, the silence pressing down on us. But before we could relax, the door handle turned again. This time quieter, more methodical. Then the sound of jingling. Keys? The door creaked open. The librarian shoved the door hard, slamming it back into the intruder. There was a grunt of pain, followed by a loud crash as whoever it was stumbled back into the shelves. Without hesitation, she grabbed us and whispered, "Run!" We bolted out of the back room and through the library, dodging overturned chairs and scattered books. The rain pounded harder against the windows, adding to the chaos. As we reached the library's exit, I glanced back and saw the figure chasing us. He was tall, wearing dark, soaked clothes, and his face was obscured by a mask. In his hand was a crowbar. We didn't stop. We ran through the halls, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I could hear the intruder's heavy footsteps pounding behind us. The librarian led us down a side corridor, toward an emergency exit. But as we neared the door, the alarm system buzzed. It was locked. Panic set in. The figure was closing in, his silhouette growing larger as he approached. Dylan pounded on the door, desperate to open it, while Jenna let out a muffled scream. Then, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the opposite hallway. It was the police. Flashlights cut through the dim corridor as officers shouted commands. The man turned, his crowbar raised, but he didn't stand a chance. The officers tackled him to the ground, pinning him as he thrashed and yelled incoherently. Later, we learned the man had broken into the school seeking refuge from the rain, but his erratic behavior escalated when he realized he'd been spotted. He was a drifter, mentally unstable, and armed with nothing more than a crowbar and paranoia. We were lucky. Lucky he didn't have anything more dangerous. Lucky the librarian had the presence of mind to act, and lucky the police arrived when they did. But even now, years later, I can't walk past a locked door or hear the sound of rain on windows without feeling a chill. That night, the line between safety and chaos felt razor thin, and we had narrowly escaped. It was my junior year, and the school year had been fairly uneventful so far. Most of the teachers were predictable, the homework was manageable, and the student body was buzzing about the upcoming Halloween carnival. But as much as I loved the season, there was something about October evenings that always made the school feel different. The long shadows in the hallways, the eerie silence when classes ended. It all set the stage for what would become the most unsettling experience of my life. It happened during one of those late afternoons when I had stayed behind for extra credit. My history teacher, Mr. Holt, had offered to let me help organize some of the archives in the basement storage. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was easy enough, and it meant I could boost my grade before the quarter ended. Plus, the archives were fascinating. A maze of old yearbooks, trophies, and dusty artifacts from decades past. When I finished sorting the last stack of files, I glanced at my watch. It was already 5:45 p.m., much later than I had planned to stay. The school was nearly empty, save for the janitors and a few teachers staying late. I grabbed my backpack, turned off the basement light, and started making my way back upstairs. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant shuffling sound, like someone dragging something heavy down a hallway. I paused at the base of the stairs, straining to listen. The noise stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. I shook it off, convincing myself it was one of the janitors moving equipment, and started climbing the stairs. As I reached the top, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered briefly, casting the hallway into momentary darkness. When the lights came back on, everything seemed off. The air felt heavier, and the once familiar hallway appeared strangely elongated, as though it stretched further than it should. I told myself I was just tired, but as I began walking toward the main doors, the shuffling sound returned, closer this time. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable now, and it was coming from the direction of the library. I turned my head slowly and caught a glimpse of movement at the far end of the hall. A shadow, tall and spindly, slipped out of sight around the corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. No response. Part of me wanted to run straight for the exit, but curiosity, or stupidity, got the better of me. I started walking toward where I had seen the shadow, my sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. The hallway seemed impossibly long, each step stretching the distance further. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. As I neared the library, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A sliver of dim light spilled out into the hall, flickering like a candle. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something about the open door pulled me in, like an invisible force urging me to step closer. I pushed the door open slowly, peering inside. The library was empty, the rows of bookshelves casting long, menacing shadows in the faint light. At the center of the room stood a single chair, slightly turned as though someone had just been sitting there. On the table in front of it lay an open book. I approached cautiously, my heart racing with each step. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and worn. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with handwritten notes and strange symbols. As I reached out to touch it, the lights in the library flickered violently before going out completely. I was plunged into darkness. That's when I heard the breathing. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breaths. Then it grew louder, closer, coming from just behind me. I spun around, my eyes straining to see in the pitch-black room. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No answer. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. Then, a whisper, low and guttural, like someone speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It came from the far corner of the room, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and moving toward me. I backed away, stumbling into the table and knocking the chair to the ground. The sound echoed through the library, followed by an unsettling stillness. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to turn on the flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. The small thud as it hit the floor felt deafening in the oppressive silence. When I bent down to grab it, a pair of feet appeared in my line of vision, standing just inches away. Bare feet, pale and dirty, with long, jagged toenails. I froze, my hand hovering over my phone, unable to move or breathe. Then the feet stepped back, disappearing into the darkness as though they had never been there. I snatched my phone and turned on the flashlight, whipping it around the room. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rows of dusty bookshelves. No one was there. I didn't wait to find out what was happening. I bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing loudly as I ran down the hallway. The shuffling sound returned, this time behind me, gaining speed. I didn't dare look back. All I could do was run, the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. As I neared the main exit, the emergency lights flickered to life, casting an eerie red glow over the lobby. The shuffling stopped. I burst through the doors into the cool night air, gasping for breath. I turned to look back at the school, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. But the building was still, its windows dark and uninviting. Whatever had been inside was gone. Or maybe it was still there, waiting. I stood outside the school for several minutes, bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. The night air was cool and damp, but it did little to soothe the burning in my chest. The school loomed behind me, silent and foreboding, its dark windows reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights. I debated what to do next. My bike was chained up near the gym entrance, but that meant going around to the back of the building. The thought of walking past those darkened windows again sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled out my phone to call my dad, but there was still no signal. Just as I decided to leave the bike and walk home, I noticed something strange. The faint light in the library had returned, flickering erratically like a dying bulb. But the lights were supposed to be off. Everything was supposed to be off. My stomach twisted as I realized I wasn't alone after all. Against all logic, I found myself walking back toward the school. It wasn't bravery that drove me, but something else, something I couldn't quite explain. A pull, like the school itself didn't want me to leave. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I approached the main doors. I half expected them to be locked, but to my surprise, they swung open with ease. The hallway was exactly as I had left it, eerily long, dimly lit, and completely silent. The emergency lights cast their crimson glow, making the space feel like something out of a nightmare. My footsteps echoed loudly as I walked back toward the library, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the library door, it was wide open. The faint light still flickered inside, but the space felt different, darker, colder. My eyes were drawn to the table where the strange book had been, but it was no longer there. Instead, the chair I had knocked over was upright again, as though someone had placed it back deliberately. A sudden creak broke the silence, and I spun around, shining my phone's flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on the far end of the room, illuminating a figure crouched between two shelves. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure stood slowly, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a puppet on strings. It was tall, unnervingly so, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed slightly too large for its body. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, those cold, glinting eyes, caught the light. They were fixed on me. "Why are you here?" the figure rasped, its voice low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and took a step forward. I stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf and sending books tumbling to the floor. "Leave," it growled, the single word reverberating through the room like a warning. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted for the door, but the moment I stepped into the hallway, it was different. The space that had been so familiar was now warped, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly, and the emergency lights flickered violently, casting everything in surreal shadows. I ran blindly, the distorted hallway stretching out in front of me. My breath came in short gasps, and my chest burned, but I didn't dare stop. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, heavy, deliberate, and closing in fast. I turned a corner, hoping to find an exit, but instead, I was met with a dead end. Panic surged through me as I realized the school had shifted, trapping me in its maze-like corridors. The footsteps grew louder, and I pressed myself against the wall, desperately searching for a way out. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, and I could feel the presence of something just beyond my line of sight. Slowly, I turned my head, and there it was, the figure, standing at the end of the hallway, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing down the corridor. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The hallway around it began to dissolve, the walls crumbling away into darkness. I could feel the floor shifting beneath me, threatening to give way. Desperation took over, and I ran toward the figure, hoping to break past it and find an escape. But as I got closer, it vanished, leaving only the faint echo of its whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." The next thing I knew, I was outside, sprawled on the wet grass in front of the school. My head spun as I tried to piece together what had happened. The building stood before me, dark and silent, as though nothing had occurred. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to find a text from my dad asking where I was. I didn't respond. Instead, I got up, grabbed my bike, and pedaled home as fast as I could. I never told anyone what happened that night. Not my friends, not my parents, not even Mr. Holt. But I avoided the school's basement and the library for the rest of the year. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the faint sound of shuffling footsteps or the whisper of a raspy voice. And when I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes, watching, waiting. I don't know what I encountered in that school, but one thing is certain. It wasn't human. The town I grew up in was surrounded by dense woods, a sprawling expanse of towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly. The woods were beautiful during the day, but became a different entity altogether at night. They bordered my high school, separated only by a rusty chain-link fence that had more holes than it did links. Teachers warned us to stay out of the woods, especially after dark, but like any group of teenagers, we didn't always listen. One crisp autumn evening, my best friend Caleb and I stayed late at school for a meeting of the film club. We were the last ones out, the janitor locking up behind us as we lingered by the parking lot. Caleb had brought his camera and suggested filming some test footage in the woods. "Come on, Riley," he said, grinning as he adjusted the strap on his camera. "The light's perfect right now. Let's get some cool shots before it gets too dark." I hesitated, glancing toward the tree line. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. I didn't like the woods, especially as the light faded, but Caleb had a way of convincing me to go along with his ideas. "Fine," I sighed, pulling my jacket tighter, but only for a few minutes. We slipped through a hole in the fence and ventured into the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound. Caleb was in his element, pointing his camera at everything. The towering trees, the golden light filtering through the branches, even the crumbling remnants of an old stone well we stumbled upon. "Check this out," he said, crouching by the well and zooming in with his lens. "This thing's ancient. It'd be perfect for a horror short." "Yeah, if you want to curse yourself," I joked, my voice sounding more nervous than I intended. "Let's not hang around too long, okay?" Caleb ignored me, focused entirely on his shot. The woods felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching us. The trees seemed to close in, their skeletal branches clawing at the darkening sky. "All right, let's move," Caleb said finally, slinging the camera over his shoulder. "I think I got enough." We started back toward the fence, but the path we'd taken and looked different now. The fading light transformed the woods into a maze, every tree trunk and shadow blending together. Caleb kept glancing at his camera, replaying the footage as we walked. "I think I got something weird," he muttered, pausing to squint at the small screen. "What do you mean, weird?" I asked, stopping beside him. There's something in the background, he said, tilting the screen toward me. The footage showed the old well, framed perfectly by the surrounding trees. But as he panned the camera, a shadowy figure appeared briefly between the trees, tall and thin, with no discernible features. Probably just a tree, I said quickly, though my stomach twisted uneasily. Caleb rewound the footage and played it again. This time, the figure seemed closer, as if it had shifted positions in the blink of an eye. "That's not a tree," he said, his voice low. "Something's out here." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping fear. "Come on, let's just get out of here. It's probably nothing." But as we continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The silence was oppressive now, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps behind us, soft, deliberate, and always just out of sync with ours. "Do you hear that?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, too afraid to speak. We both stopped, listening intently. The footsteps stopped too. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows and the dim outline of the fence in the distance. "We're almost out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come on." We quickened our pace, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet growing louder. But the footsteps returned, heavier this time, matching our speed. Caleb spun around, his camera raised, and pointed the flashlight attached to it into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure standing several yards away. It wasn't human. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, and its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank, smooth surface. It stood motionless, half hidden by the trees, its head tilted slightly as though studying us. Caleb didn't say a word. He didn't need to. We both turned and ran, sprinting through the woods toward the fence. The sound of footsteps thundered behind us, faster and louder, as though the figure was giving chase. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out at any second. But the sight of the chain-link fence ahead gave me a burst of energy. Caleb reached the fence first, dropping his camera as he scrambled through the hole. I followed, glancing back just once as I squeezed through. The figure stood at the edge of the tree line, its blank face reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights. It didn't follow us through the fence, but it didn't retreat either. It just stood there, watching. Caleb and I didn't stop running until we were halfway through the school parking lot. Only then did we dare glance back. The woods stood still and dark, but we both knew it was out there, watching. "We need to go," Caleb said breathlessly, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his car keys. "We need to get out of here. Now." His words barely registered. My mind was racing, replaying the image of that figure in the woods. Its unnatural stillness, the smooth, featureless face. It wasn't something I could explain. It wasn't something I could forget. Caleb's car roared to life, and I barely managed to climb in before he sped out of the parking lot. Neither of us spoke during the ride, the weight of what we'd seen hanging heavy between us. Only when we reached my house did Caleb finally break the silence. "I need to check the footage," he said, his voice unsteady. "Whatever that thing was, I caught it on camera." "Don't," I said, gripping the door handle. "Just delete it. We shouldn't have gone in there." But Caleb shook his head. "I can't just forget about this, Riley. We need to know what we saw." I didn't argue. I couldn't. I just wanted to get inside, lock the doors, and pretend the night had never happened. Caleb drove off, and I went straight to my room, double-checking the locks on my windows before collapsing onto my bed. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of towering shadows and footsteps that never stopped. The next morning, I woke to a flurry of texts from Caleb. "Caleb, 6:15 a.m. dude. You're not going to believe this." "Caleb, 6:17 a.m. I watched the footage. The thing was following us the whole time." "Caleb, 6:20 a.m. It's not just in the woods. I think it's here." My stomach dropped as I read the messages. The last one sent a chill through me. What did he mean? Here? I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted back, asking if he was okay, but there was no response. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I biked over to Caleb's house, my anxiety growing with each passing second. His car was in the driveway, but his house was eerily quiet. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. "Caleb?" I called, trying to peer through the windows. The curtains were drawn, and the place felt lifeless. I pulled out my phone and dialed again. Still nothing. Then I noticed the side door to his basement was slightly ajar. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. Caleb was my best friend, and if he was in trouble, I had to help. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The basement was dimly lit, the faint glow of his computer monitor casting long shadows across the cluttered space. "Caleb?" I called again, my voice echoing slightly. No response. I moved toward his desk, where his camera sat next to the computer. The footage was paused on the screen, showing a still frame of the figure from the woods. It looked closer than I remembered, its elongated limbs almost blending into the dark trees around it. I pressed play, and the video continued. The camera shook as Caleb ran, the sound of his heavy breathing filling the audio. But even as he sprinted, the figure seemed to glide effortlessly through the trees, closing the distance between them. The video cut off abruptly when Caleb dropped the camera near the fence. I clicked on another file, labeled "Last Night, Home." My hands trembled as the video began. It was a recording from inside Caleb's house, the camera propped on his desk. Caleb sat in front of the lens, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know what we saw," he said, his voice low and shaking, "but it followed us. I've seen it outside my window. It's watching me." He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting to the darkened room behind him. "I think it wants me to come back. It doesn't feel like I have a choice." The video ended there. My stomach churned as I stared at the blank screen. Where was Caleb? Why hadn't he answered my calls? A faint creak behind me made my blood run cold. I turned slowly, expecting to see Caleb, but the basement was empty. The shadows seemed darker now, stretching unnaturally across the walls. Then I saw it. At the base of the stairs, just barely visible in the dim light, was the figure. Its smooth, featureless face tilted toward me, and its impossibly long arms hung at its sides. I froze, unable to move or even scream. The figure didn't step forward. It didn't need to. Instead, it raised one hand and pointed at me, just as it had in the woods. My chest tightened, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I don't remember running. All I know is that I ended up outside, gasping for air as I sprinted toward my bike. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I pedaled as fast as I could, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. I never saw Caleb again. His parents filed a missing person report, but no one could explain his disappearance. The footage on his computer was wiped clean, leaving no evidence of what we'd seen, or what had taken him. The school fenced off the woods not long after, citing safety concerns, but I knew the truth. The fence wouldn't stop it. Nothing would. To this day, I can feel it watching me, its presence lingering in the shadows. I don't go near the woods anymore, but I see it in my dreams. It doesn't speak. It doesn't move. It just waits. And one day, I know it will come for me too. When I was 16, I lived in a small, sleepy town nestled between thick woods and rolling hills. Our high school, Cedar Ridge High, sat on the outskirts, its sprawling campus bordered by dense forests that stretched for miles. It was a quiet place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Until that fall afternoon, the day started like any other. My best friends, Mia and Jordan, and I were hanging out in the courtyard before the first bell, gossiping about the upcoming football game. The air was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot as the early signs of autumn spread across campus. We didn't know it yet, but it was the last normal morning we'd ever have. The first 3 periods passed uneventfully. I remember sitting in history class, half listening to Mr. Garland drone on about the Industrial Revolution, when the intercom buzzed to life. The principal's voice, usually calm and warm, crackled with urgency. "Attention, students and staff. This is a lockdown. I repeat, we are going into a lockdown. This is not a drill. Please follow protocol immediately." For a moment, the room was frozen in stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Chairs scraped, students whispered nervously, and Mr. Garland barked orders, herding us to the far corner of the classroom. The blinds were drawn, the lights turned off, and the door was locked. The atmosphere was suffocating, every rustle and creak amplified in the darkness. At first, we speculated it was another prank. Cedar Ridge had its share of jokers. But as the minutes dragged into an hour, fear began to set in. Whispers spread about a man seen lingering near the woods earlier in the day, dressed in dirty overalls and carrying an axe. Some thought it was a hunter who'd lost his way. Others claimed he'd been watching the school. It wasn't until someone's phone buzzed with a news alert that the truth began to unravel. A manhunt was underway for an escaped convict, a dangerous one. The notification described him as a large, bearded man in his 40s, last seen near the Cedar Ridge forest. My heart sank. The pieces clicked together too neatly. The man in the woods, the lockdown, the news alert. It wasn't a coincidence. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the room became unbearable. Some students silently cried, while others tried to text their parents. Mr. Garland's reassuring words felt hollow. He was just as scared as we were. And then came the moment that shattered the fragile calm. A sound echoed through the hallway outside. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, like boots on the linoleum floor. Everyone froze, eyes darting to the door. The steps grew louder, closer. The doorknob jiggled. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a teacher or a security guard. They would have used a key. Whoever was out there wanted in. Mr. Garland motioned for us to stay silent, his face pale. The doorknob stopped moving, but the footsteps didn't retreat. Instead, they circled, pausing at other classrooms. I glanced at Mia, her eyes wide with terror. Jordan mouthed something to me, but I couldn't focus. My ears were trained on the footsteps, each one sending a chill down my spine. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. A door slamming open somewhere down the hall. A scream pierced the silence, followed by frantic footsteps. Whoever was in the hallway wasn't alone. Panic took over. I clutched Mia's hand as we crouched lower, trying to make ourselves invisible. The noise outside escalated. Shouting, pounding, the sound of someone running. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Mr. Garland whispered for us to stay put, his voice shaking. But I couldn't. My curiosity and fear were at war, and curiosity won. Against my better judgment, I crawled toward the blinds, peeking through the tiniest gap. What I saw chilled me to the core. Down the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, was the shadowy figure of a man. He stood unnervingly still, his head tilted slightly as if listening. He held something long in his hand, an axe or a crowbar, I couldn't tell. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned his head toward me. I ducked back, heart hammering, praying he hadn't seen me. But deep down, I knew he had. I barely dared to breathe as I huddled next to Mia and Jordan. My mind raced with possibilities. What would happen if he came for our door? What could we do? The room was silent except for the occasional muffled sniffle of someone crying. Every sound in the hallway seemed amplified. The distant hum of fluorescent lights, the creak of the old floors, and the faint echo of footsteps retreating. But I couldn't shake the image of the man's shadowy figure. He had seen me. I was sure of it. That subtle tilt of his head, like he knew someone was watching. It sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to tell Mr. Garland, but fear kept my mouth shut. If he didn't know where we were, I wasn't about to give us away. The minutes dragged on like hours. The only light in the room came from the faint glow of a few phones. My own phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it, too afraid the sound might carry. Someone near me whispered, "Do you think they caught him?" But no one answered. Then, it happened. The silence outside was broken by a loud clatter, something metal hitting the floor. It was close, too close. The sound jolted everyone, and Mr. Garland held up a finger to his lips, signaling us to stay silent. A second later, there was a scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. The dragging sound stopped right outside our door. I swear my heart stopped in that moment. I gripped Mia's hand so tightly she winced, but I couldn't let go. The door handle turned slowly, almost lazily. as if whoever was on the other side wanted us to know they were there. I locked eyes with Mr. Garland, who stood frozen near the door, his hand hovering over the light switch. He had positioned himself to look like he wasn't there, blending into the shadows. But we both knew there was no hiding if the door opened. And then, just as suddenly, the handle stopped moving. A long, agonizing pause followed. The man didn't enter, but he didn't leave either. Instead, I heard the faintest sound, breathing, heavy, deliberate breathing, as though he were testing the air. Finally, the footsteps started again, but this time they were moving away. Relief washed over me like a wave, but it was short-lived. A loud crash from the far end of the hall shattered the moment, followed by shouting. Someone yelled, "Police!" Hands in the air. Gunshots rang out, 3 in quick succession. Screams erupted from somewhere in the building. I froze, unsure of what to do. Mr. Garland whispered for us to stay down, his voice trembling, but my instinct screamed to run, to get as far away as possible. And then came the most terrifying sound of all, a deep, guttural scream, unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't pain or fear, it was rage. Pure, unbridled rage. For what felt like forever, the school was plunged into chaos. The pounding of footsteps, the shouts of officers, and the distant wail of sirens outside all blurred together. But inside our room, we stayed still, paralyzed by fear. When the noise finally subsided, it felt as though the air itself had stilled. Mr. Garland whispered, "Stay here," and crept toward the door. He pressed his ear against it, listening intently. After what felt like an eternity, he turned back to us. "It's over," he said, his voice shaking. "The police got him." A collective sigh of relief filled the room, but I wasn't convinced. Something felt wrong. The chaos had ended too abruptly, as if a page had been turned in a book, but the story wasn't finished. After several more minutes, the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, students and staff. The lockdown is lifted. Please remain in your classrooms until law enforcement clears your area." One by one, officers arrived to escort us out. As we stepped into the hallway, I couldn't help but glance toward the spot where I'd seen the man earlier. There was nothing there, just a puddle of dark liquid and a discarded axe lying nearby. Outside, the police had cordoned off the entire school. Parents were arriving in droves, faces pale with worry. I spotted my mom in the crowd and ran to her, burying my face in her shoulder. For the first time that day, I let the tears flow. Later, we learned the full story. The man, a convicted murderer, had escaped a nearby prison 3 days earlier. He had been hiding in the woods near the school, scavenging for food. That morning, he slipped onto the campus grounds, blending in with workers arriving for the day. His plan was never clear, whether he intended to harm someone or was simply desperate. What we did know was that he had been armed and extremely dangerous. But there was one detail that kept me awake for weeks afterward. When the police searched his belongings, they found a list of names. Mine was on it. It was a Friday night in late October, and our high school football team, the Fairmont Falcons, was playing their biggest game of the season. The stadium lights lit up the field, and the air was electric with the cheers of students, parents, and fans. I wasn't much of a football person, but my best friend, Alex, had dragged me there with promises of snacks, a good time, and plenty of people watching. The game had just started, and the bleachers were packed. I remember sitting in the student section, laughing at something stupid Alex said, when I noticed a man standing near the fence at the far end of the field. He looked out of place, dressed in a dark coat, worn jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. While everyone else was cheering or chatting, he stood perfectly still, watching the crowd instead of the game. I nudged Alex and pointed him out. "Who do you think that is?" Alex shrugged. "Probably some dad who doesn't care about football either." But something about the man unsettled me. He didn't look like anyone's dad. There was a stiffness to him, like he didn't belong here. I shook it off, convincing myself I was overthinking. After all, it was a big game. People from all over town showed up. As the night went on, the game grew more intense, and the crowd became rowdier. I started to forget about the man at the fence until halftime. The marching band took the field, and Alex ran off to grab snacks from the concession stand. I stayed behind, scrolling through my phone when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced up, scanning the crowd, and my stomach dropped. The man was no longer at the fence. He was now standing near the bleachers, closer to the student section. His head was tilted slightly, as if trying to pick someone out of the crowd. I ducked down instinctively, hoping he wouldn't notice me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. He wasn't watching the band. He wasn't watching the game. He was scanning the bleachers, his movements slow and deliberate. Alex returned a few minutes later, holding 2 sodas and a tub of popcorn. "You good? You look like you've seen a ghost." I told him about the man and how he seemed to be getting closer. Alex, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "You've been watching too many crime shows. He's probably looking for his kid or something." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The man wasn't looking for anyone. He was hunting. The game resumed, and I tried to focus on the field, but my mind kept drifting back to the man. By the 4th quarter, he was gone again, but I couldn't relax. Every time I scanned the crowd, I expected to see him lurking nearby. When the game ended, the Falcons had won, and the crowd spilled out of the stadium, buzzing with excitement. Alex and I walked toward the parking lot, our breaths visible in the cool night air. The parking lot was chaos, with cars honking and people shouting goodbyes. As we approached Alex's car, I spotted him again. The man was leaning against a lamppost at the edge of the lot, his face obscured by shadows. My heart raced. He wasn't here for the game. He'd been watching the students all night. Watching us. "Alex, he's there," I whispered, grabbing his arm. Alex followed my gaze and frowned. "That guy? Okay, yeah, that's creepy." He hesitated, then added, "Let's just get to the car." We hurried to the car, trying not to look like we were running. Alex fumbled with his keys, finally unlocking the doors. As we climbed in, I glanced back toward the lamppost. The man was gone. We sat there for a moment, the car's engine idling. "Maybe he left," Alex offered, but his voice lacked conviction. I wanted to believe him, but my gut told me otherwise. The man hadn't left. He was hiding, watching. Alex and I pulled out of the chaotic parking lot, merging onto the narrow, dimly lit road that led back into town. The stadium lights disappeared behind us, and the hum of the crowd was replaced by the low drone of the car engine. Alex tried to lighten the mood, making jokes about our school's lousy defense, but my nerves were still on edge. "Do you think we should have told someone about that guy?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Told who? The cops?" "Hi, there was a creepy dude at the football game. They'd laugh at us," Alex said, glancing at me. "But if it makes you feel better, we'll keep an eye out." His nonchalant tone didn't help. I stared out the window, my reflection blending with the passing trees. The road was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, fueled by my overactive imagination. And then I saw it. In the distance, a pair of headlights appeared behind us. They were faint at first, barely visible through the haze of the night, but they were gaining fast. My stomach knotted as the headlights grew brighter, their beam cutting through the darkness. "Alex," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There's a car following us." Alex glanced in the rearview mirror. "Relax. It's just someone heading home from the game." But as the car closed the gap between us, its headlights almost blinding, I could see it wasn't just any car. It was a dark sedan. My breath caught in my throat. It looked exactly like the one the man had been standing near in the parking lot. The sedan stayed on our tail, not passing, not turning, just following. Alex's confidence wavered, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "Okay, that's weird. Do something," I urged, panic rising in my voice. Alex nodded, taking a sharp turn onto a side road. The sedan followed. He sped up, weaving through the narrow streets. But no matter where we went, the car stayed right behind us. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. "We need to call the police," I said, fumbling for my phone. "Not yet," Alex replied, his voice tense. "Let's see if we can lose him first." The road ahead narrowed, flanked by tall trees on either side. Alex turned onto a gravel road leading into the woods, the tires kicking up dust and rocks. The sedan followed, its headlights bouncing as it navigated the uneven terrain. This was a bad idea, I shouted, gripping the door handle. No kidding, Alex snapped, slamming the accelerator. The car jolted over the rough road, the trees closing in around us. The sedan stayed close, its lights like twin eyes boring into us. Finally, Alex spotted a clearing up ahead and swerved into it, killing the engine and turning off the lights. We sat in silence, our breathing ragged, hoping the sedan would pass us by. For a moment, all we could hear was the distant rustling of leaves and the creak of the cooling engine. And then the sedan stopped. Its headlights pierced the clearing, illuminating our car like a spotlight. My chest tightened as the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out. It was him, the man from the stadium. He stood motionless, staring at our car, the shadows of the trees distorting his silhouette. "Stay quiet," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. The man took a step forward, then another. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. He reached into his coat and pulled something out. At first, I thought it was a flashlight, but when the light caught the object, my blood ran cold. It was a knife. "We're calling the cops now," Alex hissed, grabbing his phone. But before he could dial, the man broke into a sprint, heading straight for us. "Go, go, go!" I screamed. Alex fumbled to restart the car, the engine sputtering before roaring to life. He slammed the gas pedal, the tires spinning in the gravel before catching traction. The car lurched forward, narrowly missing the man as he swung the knife, the blade scraping against the side of the car with a metallic screech. We sped down the gravel road, the sedan's headlights vanishing behind us. My hands trembled as I dialed 911. Relaying everything to the operator through gasps and tears. They promised to send officers to the area, but it felt like an eternity before we reached the safety of the main road. When we finally pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a gas station, Alex cut the engine, and we both sat in stunned silence. Neither of us spoke, our minds replaying the events over and over. The police arrived shortly after, taking our statements and assuring us they'd patrol the area. But the man and his car were never found. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his shadowy figure, heard the scrape of his knife against the car. The police told us it was likely a drifter, someone passing through town, but I wasn't convinced. He'd been watching us, following us, and part of me feared he wasn't done. It was the summer after my senior year of high school, and I was house-sitting for my aunt while she went on a 2-week cruise. She lived in a quiet, rural neighborhood, the kind where the houses were far apart, and the only sounds at night were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. At first, I thought it would be fun. An entire house to myself, no parents around, and the freedom to do whatever I wanted. But by the end of the second night, I wished I had never agreed. The house was old, creaky, and filled with an unsettling number of antique dolls and faded portraits that seemed to watch you as you moved. My aunt's golden retriever, Max, was supposed to keep me company, but even his usually friendly demeanor seemed off in that house. He'd often sit in the living room, staring intently at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. His ears perked up as though he could hear something I couldn't. On the third night, the uneasiness began to creep in. I had just finished watching a movie in the living room when I noticed something odd. The motion-activated porch light in the backyard flicked on. I froze, staring at the sliding glass door, half expecting to see a raccoon or some other harmless animal. But the yard was empty. No movement, no sign of life. "Must have been the wind," I muttered, trying to convince myself, but Max didn't buy it. He growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the door. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly locked the door, pulling the curtains shut. I went to bed that night feeling unsettled, but nothing else happened. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation getting to me. But the next night was worse. It started around midnight. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint tapping sound. It was soft at first, like someone gently knocking on a window. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time louder and more deliberate. Max, who who had been sleeping at the foot of my bed, bolted upright, his ears perked. He growled again, a deep, guttural sound that made my stomach twist. Slowly, I climbed out of bed, my heart pounding, and crept to the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The backyard was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the motion-activated light. I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the trees and the shadows they cast. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched was so strong it was almost suffocating. I closed the curtain and backed away, my hands trembling. Probably just an animal, I whispered to myself, trying to calm down, but Max didn't relax. He followed me as I walked through the house, checking every door and window to make sure they were locked. By the time I climbed back into bed, the tapping had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. The next day, I tried to brush it off, but the sense of unease lingered. I spent most of the day outside, avoiding the house as much as possible. When evening came, I reluctantly returned, promising myself I'd go to bed early and get a good night's sleep. But that night, things escalated. It was just past midnight when I heard the tapping again. This time, it wasn't soft or tentative. It was sharp, insistent, and it wasn't coming from the backyard. It was coming from the front of the house. Max barked furiously, racing to the front door. I followed him, my heart in my throat, and peered through the peephole. My breath caught in my chest. A man was standing on the porch. He was tall and wiry, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the shadows. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap, but I could see enough to know he wasn't someone I recognized. He stood perfectly still, staring straight at the door, as though he knew I was watching. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Who was he? What did he want? I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't just ignore him either. Before I could decide what to do, he knocked again. 3 hard, deliberate knocks that echoed through the quiet house. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response, just silence. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My hands trembling so badly I could barely type. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but in a town this small, I knew it would take time for them to arrive. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, Max still barking at the door. The man didn't leave. He just stood there, motionless, as though he had all the time in the world. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, waiting for the police to arrive. When they did, they found no trace of the man, no footprints, no sign he had ever been there. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew he'd be back. The next day, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the sound of Max softly whining at the foot of my bed. For a brief moment, I let myself believe the events of the previous night had been a bad dream. But when I walked to the front door, I saw the scratches. Deep, jagged marks raked across the wood, right next to the doorknob. My stomach flipped. Whoever had been on the porch last night had tried to get in. The police had promised to patrol the area, but their reassurance felt empty. I locked every door and window in the house, and even dragged a chair in front of the sliding glass door in the living room. Max was unusually quiet, his eyes darting toward every creak and shadow. If he wasn't calm, how could I be? That night, I went to bed early, hoping the daylight would linger in my mind long enough for me to fall asleep. I left my phone on the nightstand, the flashlight app open just in case. Max curled up beside me, but neither of us really relaxed. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that made every small noise seem louder than it should be. I lay there for hours, my heart beating faster with every creak of the old house. Around 1 a.m., it started again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't just at the front door. It was coming from multiple windows, moving around the house. First the living room, then the kitchen, then my bedroom window. It was calculated, deliberate, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were back. Max leapt off the bed, barking furiously at the window. I froze, my mind racing. The curtains were closed, but I didn't dare look outside. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 again, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. The operator assured me officers were on their way, but I didn't feel any safer. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that made your ears ring. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, movement. But there was nothing. And then I heard it. The sound of glass breaking. It came from the living room. Max bolted out of the bedroom, barking wildly. I followed, clutching a flashlight and my phone. When I reached the living room, my worst fear was confirmed. The sliding glass door had been shattered. The chair I'd placed in front of it knocked over. Cold air blew in from the backyard, carrying with it the metallic smell of fear. "Max, come," I whispered, my voice trembling. He was growling at something, someone, in the darkness beyond the shattered door. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it toward the backyard. At first, I saw nothing but the trees swaying in the breeze. Then the beam landed on him. The man stood just beyond the door, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. His dark clothes blended into the night, but his face was visible now, pale, gaunt, with wild eyes that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. "Stay back," I shouted, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Max barked louder, stepping closer to the broken door, his teeth bared. The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused. Then he raised his hand, and I saw it, a large hunting knife glinting in the light. My breath caught in my throat. He took a step forward, then another. Max lunged, but I grabbed his collar, pulling him back. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I had to get out of the house, but where could I go? He was blocking the only exit. Before I could decide, the sound of distant sirens broke through the night. The man froze, his head snapping toward the direction of the noise. For a moment, he stood there, as if debating whether to run or stay. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods. The police arrived minutes later, but by then, he was long gone. They searched the area, but the woods were dense, and there was no sign of him. The officers assured me they'd increase patrols and offered to stay until sunrise, but their presence didn't erase the terror that clung to the house. The next morning, I called my aunt and told her everything. She insisted I leave immediately and stay with my parents until she got back. I didn't argue. By noon, I had packed up Max and was driving away from that house as fast as I could. The police never found the man. They believed he was a drifter, someone who had been squatting in the woods. But there was one thing they couldn't explain. When they examined the broken glass door, they found something chilling carved into the wooden frame. A single word. Soon. To this day, I don't know what he wanted or why he targeted that house. But every so often, I still wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear tapping on my window. I've always considered myself a fairly social person. Being a young woman living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I made an effort to get to know the people on my street. Most of them were older couples, retired and friendly, though there were a few young families here and there. Moving into my new house last year felt like a fresh start after some tough times, and the neighborhood seemed perfect, peaceful, safe, and with just the right amount of community interaction. It started innocently enough. About 2 months after I moved in, I met a man named Jake while I was unloading groceries from my car. He lived 2 doors down and seemed like the quintessential helpful neighbor. He had a warm smile, was in his mid-40s, and always offered to help whenever he saw me struggling with something. At first, I thought it was nice to have someone looking out for me, especially since I lived alone. Jake would often stop by to chat whenever I was outside. He always had some funny anecdote about his dog or a story about the neighborhood's history. Over time, I noticed he had an impeccable knack for showing up whenever I was doing something outdoors, gardening, checking the mail, even just enjoying coffee on my porch. He seemed friendly, albeit a little too observant. Then, one Saturday, he knocked on my door with a basket of baked goods, claiming his wife had made too much. I thanked him and invited him in for a brief chat. He looked around my living room with what felt like more curiosity than politeness, but I chalked it up to neighborly interest. I didn't think much of it until later that night. Uninvited observations. I was in bed around 11 p.m., scrolling through my phone, when I thought I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I dismissed it as a tree branch brushing against the window. But then it came again, slightly louder, deliberate. My stomach sank. Living alone meant I was hyper-aware of every noise in my house, and this wasn't normal. I got up and tiptoed to the window. Peeking through the blinds, I couldn't see anything unusual. The street was quiet, and no one appeared to be outside. Convinced I was overreacting, I returned to bed but left the light on in the hallway. The tapping didn't return that night. The next morning, I mentioned it to Jake casually while walking to my car. His response was unsettling. "Oh, yeah. I saw your bedroom light on late last night. You should get some blackout curtains. It's easy to tell when someone's awake in your house." It was such an odd thing to say, but I didn't know how to respond. I managed a polite laugh and made an excuse to leave. That was when I started to notice other strange behaviors. Jake seemed to know things he shouldn't, details about when I left for work, the days I worked from home, and even my preferred grocery store. He'd bring it up casually, but it always left me wondering how he knew. A few weeks passed, and Jake's behavior continued to toe the line between friendly and intrusive. He always seemed to know where I was, what I was doing, and even small details about my routines. I started making subtle changes, switching up the times I left the house, parking my car further down the street, but it didn't seem to matter. Jake always found a way to stay one step ahead. One evening, I decided to test a theory. I kept the lights in my living room off and sat quietly, waiting to see if he would appear. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, I saw the faint glow of a flashlight beam moving outside my window. My heart raced as I watched the light sweep across the front yard and then disappear into the shadows. I wanted to confront him, to catch him in the act, but fear paralyzed me. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I explained the situation, emphasizing that while nothing overtly threatening had happened, his behavior was making me uncomfortable. They said they'd send someone to patrol the area, but warned me that without direct evidence of a crime, their hands were tied. Crossing the line. The next morning, I found something on my porch that made my blood run cold. It was a bouquet of daisies, neatly arranged in a glass vase, with a note attached, "You're so beautiful when you're quiet." I froze, staring at the note, my mind racing. This wasn't just neighborly kindness anymore. It was a direct invasion of my personal space. I spent the rest of the day looking for ways to secure my home. I installed new locks on my doors, added motion sensor lights, and even purchased a security camera. I told myself that these measures would give me peace of mind, but deep down, I knew Jake wasn't the type to be deterred easily. Later that evening, I checked the footage from the camera I had installed near my front door. It didn't take long before I spotted him. Around 2 a.m., Jake appeared in the frame. He was standing on my porch, just staring at my front door. He didn't knock, didn't move, just stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally walking away. I couldn't sleep after that. The idea of him being that close, in the middle of the night, was too much to handle. The next morning, I called the police again and showed them the footage. They promised to look into it and said they'd speak with Jake, but once again, they reminded me that unless he made a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. The breaking point. That night, everything came to a head. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone had broken into my house. I locked myself in the bathroom and listened intently, trying to determine where the intruder was. I could hear footsteps moving through the house, slow and deliberate. The operator stayed on the line, assuring me that officers were on their way, but those minutes felt like hours. Then, the footsteps stopped, right outside the bathroom door. "Claire," a voice whispered. My blood ran cold. It was Jake. "You don't have to be scared. I just want to talk." I didn't respond. My trembling hands gripped the phone as I prayed the police would arrive in time. Jake jiggled the door handle and knocked softly. "Come on, Claire. I know you're in there." Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Jake's tone changed. "You called the cops?" he hissed, his voice filled with anger. I heard him retreat, the sound of his footsteps fading as he fled the house. The police arrived moments later and found Jake trying to escape through my backyard. They arrested him on the spot, and I later learned that he had a long history of stalking and harassment in other neighborhoods. Somehow, he had managed to fly under the radar until now. Aftermath. It's been 6 months since that night, and I've moved to a new city in the hopes of leaving this nightmare behind. Jake is still in jail, but the thought of him ever getting out keeps me awake some nights. I've learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to never ignore the signs when something, or someone, feels off. They say your neighbors are supposed to make you feel safe, but I've learned that appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes, the people who seem the friendliest are the ones you should fear the most. I always thought of my job as uneventful. Working as a night security guard at a mid-sized warehouse wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid well, and I enjoyed the quiet solitude. The place stored various electronics, so my main task was to ensure no one broke in and that nothing seemed out of place during my rounds. Most nights, I'd bring a book or listen to music while keeping an eye on the monitors. It was dull but easy, until one particular night changed everything. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of town, bordered by dense woods on one side and an empty industrial park on the other. It wasn't uncommon to hear strange noises from the forest, animals rustling through the underbrush or the occasional owl hooting in the distance. I'd gotten used to it over time, but that night, something felt different. I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m., as usual, and everything seemed normal. The other guard, Steve, was just finishing up, and we exchanged the usual small talk before he left. I settled into my routine, watching the security monitors that displayed various parts of the warehouse and its perimeter. Around midnight, I began my first round, walking through the aisles of neatly stacked pallets. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound, and the stillness of the place felt heavier than usual. As I reached the far end of the warehouse, I noticed something odd. One of the emergency exit doors at the back was slightly ajar. This was unusual because those doors were always locked, and opening them would trigger an alarm. Yet, no alarms had gone off. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight on the door. It swung open with a creak, revealing the dark woods beyond. A chill ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just a mechanical issue. After securing the door, I continued my patrol, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Back in the control room, I rewound the security footage for that area. The camera facing the emergency exit was partially obscured by a stack of pallets, but I could still make out the door slowly opening on its own. There was no one visible in the footage. My stomach tightened as I watched it play out again. The door had remained open for several minutes before I arrived to close it. I told myself it was probably just the wind or a faulty latch, though the explanation didn't sit well with me. About an hour later, while reviewing the monitors, I noticed movement in the camera covering the rear loading dock. A dark figure darted out of frame so quickly that I wasn't sure I'd seen anything at all. I leaned in closer, rewound the footage, and replayed it. This time, I caught it. A shadowy figure moving just at the edge of the camera's view. It didn't look like an animal. The movements were deliberate, almost human. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the loading dock. The air was colder than usual, and the silence felt oppressive. I scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound, like a low whisper, coming from the woods. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound grew louder, though I couldn't make out any words. My heart pounded as I backed away from the dock and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. Returning to the control room, I kept a close watch on the monitors, my nerves on edge. The warehouse was still and quiet, but the unease lingered. Around 3 a.m., the motion detector alarm went off, signaling movement in the east wing of the building. My pulse quickened as I switched to the corresponding camera feed. The screen flickered momentarily before showing the same shadowy figure, now inside the warehouse, standing motionless in the middle of the aisle. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but stopped when the figure suddenly turned toward the camera. Though the image was grainy, I could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. It was featureless, a smooth expanse where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. The figure tilted its head, as if it knew I was watching, before disappearing from view. I was frozen in my chair, trying to process what I'd just seen. The silence was broken by a loud crash from somewhere in the warehouse. It sounded like a stack of pallets had been knocked over. Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed the baton from my belt and reluctantly headed toward the noise. The crash had come from the far corner of the warehouse, near the section where spare parts for electronics were stored. My flashlight beam shook as I approached, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The air felt heavier with each step, the silence pressing in around me like a living thing. When I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. An entire row of shelves had toppled over, spilling crates and boxes across the floor. Some of the boxes had burst open, their contents scattered like the aftermath of a storm. But what chilled me to my core wasn't the mess. It was the figure standing at the far end of the aisle. The same shadowy, faceless figure I had seen on the monitors. It didn't move, didn't react to the beam of my flashlight. It just stood there, unnaturally still, its head tilted slightly as though studying me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. The air was thick with an unnatural cold that made it hard to breathe. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative, though my voice cracked. There was no reply, no sound at all. The figure remained motionless, its presence as overwhelming as the silence around it. Slowly, I took a step back, then another, never taking my eyes off the figure. Suddenly, it moved, not toward me, but to the side, disappearing behind a stack of crates. I hesitated for only a moment before turning and running back toward the control room. My mind raced as I locked the door behind me, grabbing my phone to call the police. As I dialed, the monitors flickered, static crackling across the screens. The feed came back, but it was distorted, the images warping and twisting as though something was interfering with the signal. On one of the screens, I saw the figure again, now standing in the center of the control room hallway. It was closer than ever. The dispatcher answered, and I stammered out my location and a plea for help. "There's someone inside the building," I said, my voice shaking. "Send someone. Please hurry. We have officers on the way," the dispatcher assured me, though her words felt distant, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I watched the monitors, my eyes glued to the hallway feed. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. Then, the lights went out. The entire warehouse plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the monitors, which flickered with static. I scrambled for my flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the void. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pointed the light toward the control room door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. A sound broke the silence, a faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. It was coming from the window beside the monitors. I turned the flashlight toward it, and my blood ran cold. The figure was there, pressed against the glass, its faceless head tilted at an unnatural angle. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though it were testing the barrier between us. The sound of sirens in the distance snapped me out of my terror. Help was coming, but the figure didn't seem to care. It stepped back from the window, fading into the shadows just as the red and blue lights of police cars illuminated the parking lot outside. When the officers arrived, I met them at the front entrance, my hands trembling as I explained what had happened. They searched the warehouse thoroughly, but there was no sign of the figure or any evidence of a break-in beyond the fallen shelves. The footage from the security cameras was corrupted, the images distorted beyond recognition. They chalked it up to a prank or my imagination running wild. But I knew better. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't stay in that warehouse, not after what I'd seen. Weeks later, I heard from a former coworker that strange things continued to happen during the night shifts. Objects moving on their own, unexplained cold spots, and the occasional glimpse of a shadowy figure on the monitors. I don't know what it was that haunted that warehouse, and I don't want to know. All I know is that whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't finished. The summer after I graduated college, I took a job working nights at a 24-hour diner just off the interstate. The pay wasn't great, but the tips were decent, and the shifts were quiet enough that I could sometimes catch up on reading or writing between customers. The diner had a sort of retro charm, with its chrome counters and vinyl booths, but the best thing about it was the view of the surrounding countryside. During the day, you could see rolling hills stretching into the horizon. At night, it was nothing but darkness and the occasional headlights from passing cars. Most nights were uneventful. Regulars would come in, truckers, travelers, and the occasional insomniac looking for coffee and pie. But there was one night, just a few weeks into the job, that I'll never forget. It started like any other, with me wiping down tables and chatting with our cook, Frank, who worked the grill in the open kitchen. By 2 a.m., the diner was empty except for a man sitting in the corner booth, nursing his coffee. He had been there for almost an hour, staring out the window into the blackness. He looked ordinary enough, mid-40s, wearing a faded jacket and a baseball cap, but something about him unsettled me. He barely spoke when I brought him refills, only muttering a low, "Thanks," without meeting my eyes. His gaze stayed fixed on the window, as though he were expecting something or someone. Around 2:30, another car pulled into the lot. It was an old sedan, its headlights cutting through the dark before shutting off. A woman stepped out, her movements hurried and nervous. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with long blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail. She came inside and glanced around, her eyes lingering on the man in the corner booth before she approached the counter. "Can I use your phone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My car broke down a few miles back, and my cell is dead." I nodded and handed her the diner's landline. She thanked me and dialed a number, turning her back to the rest of the room as she spoke in hushed tones. I tried not to eavesdrop, but her voice carried. "I don't care what time it is, Jason," she hissed. "I need you to come get me. Please. It's not safe out here." When she hung up, she stayed by the counter, fidgeting with her hands. I offered her a glass of water, which she accepted with a shaky smile. Frank, who had been watching from the kitchen, gave me a questioning look, but I just shrugged. The man in the booth hadn't moved or acknowledged the woman's presence, but I noticed his eyes flicking toward her reflection in the window. Something about the atmosphere shifted. The diner, which had always felt like a safe haven during my shifts, now felt claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional clink of dishes in the sink. "Mind if I wait here?" the woman asked, her voice softer now. "I don't want to go back out there." "Of course," I said. "Take a seat wherever you're comfortable." She chose a booth near the counter, as far from the man in the corner as possible. Frank came out from the kitchen and leaned against the counter, his eyes darting between the two customers. "Weird night, huh?" he muttered under his breath. I nodded but didn't respond. My attention was drawn to the window. The darkness outside seemed thicker than usual, almost tangible. It reminded me of something I'd read once about the way isolation can play tricks on your mind. But this didn't feel like a trick. It felt real. At around 3 a.m., the man in the corner booth finally stood up. He left a crumpled bill on the table and walked toward the door. As he passed the woman's booth, he paused, his shadow falling over her. She stiffened, her hand clutching the edge of the table. "Be careful out there," he said, his voice low and rough. "They don't like to let people leave." Before she, or I, could respond, he stepped outside. The bell above the door jingled, and then he was gone, swallowed by the night. The woman and I exchanged uneasy glances, neither of us sure what to make of his words. Frank shook his head and muttered something about drunks, but even he seemed on edge. I went to clear the man's table and found something strange. Beneath the crumpled bill was a napkin with a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It comes from the trees. Don't look too long." I froze, staring at the words as a chill crept down my spine. When I showed it to Frank, he laughed it off, but the woman looked pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the lights in the diner flickered, just for a moment, but long enough to send a jolt of fear through all of us. The woman glanced toward the window, and I followed her gaze. In the distance, at the edge of the parking lot where the trees began, something moved. The movement at the edge of the parking lot was subtle at first, like the shifting of shadows under a faint breeze. But then it became unmistakable. Something large and hunched was moving among the trees, just beyond the reach of the diner's floodlights. It wasn't the shape of any animal I'd ever seen. It seemed too tall, too unnaturally thin, with long, jerky movements as it stepped out of the tree line. The woman gasped and shrank into her booth. Frank, who had been halfway through making a snide remark, fell silent, his face paling as he followed our gaze. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the figure as it moved closer, the darkness around it seeming to warp and twist as though the night itself bent to its will. It stopped just short of the floodlights, lingering at the edge of their glow, as though testing their reach. "Lock the door," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. Frank didn't need to be told twice. He bolted to the entrance and turned the lock, pulling down the shade over the window. "Whatever it is, it's not coming in here," he said, though his tone betrayed his fear. The diner fell silent again, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every breath feel deafening. I moved slowly back to the counter, keeping my eyes on the figure outside. It hadn't moved any closer but remained there, swaying slightly, as though waiting. The woman spoke up again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw something like this earlier, when my car broke down. I thought it was just my imagination. I told myself it couldn't be real." "What do you mean, something like this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched her glass of water. "When I was walking to find help, I felt like I was being followed. I turned around and I saw it, just for a second, in the trees. It looked like it was watching me, but when I blinked, it was gone. I thought maybe I was just tired or scared, but now—" She trailed off, glancing toward the shaded window. Frank paced behind the counter, muttering curses under his breath. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Kids messing around, trying to freak us out." I shook my head. "That doesn't move like any person I've ever seen." Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered again. This time, they stayed off for a full 5 seconds before sputtering back to life. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs felt louder than ever in the oppressive silence that followed. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. The woman let out a shaky breath, and Frank stopped pacing, relief momentarily washing over his face. But my gut told me this wasn't over. I stepped cautiously toward the window, lifting the edge of the shade to peer outside. The parking lot looked empty, the trees at the edge still and quiet. But as I scanned the area, I caught something, a flash of movement reflected in the glass. I spun around just in time to see one of the side windows rattling violently, as though something was trying to force its way inside. The woman screamed, and Frank grabbed a heavy metal spatula from the grill, holding it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, though it was clear he was as terrified as the rest of us. The rattling stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I backed away from the window. The woman was sobbing quietly now, her hands pressed to her mouth. Then came the tapping. It was soft at first, almost tentative, like a single fingernail lightly brushing against the glass. But it grew louder, sharper, and more insistent, moving from one window to the next, circling the diner like a predator toying with its prey. I couldn't tell if it was coming from a single source or multiple, if there was one figure out there or many. "Stay away from the windows," I said, my voice trembling. "Whatever you do, don't look outside." The woman nodded, curling into the corner of her booth. But Frank didn't listen. He moved toward the window nearest the kitchen, gripping his spatula tightly. "We can't just sit here," he said. "We have to do something." "Frank, don't," I started, but it was too late. He pulled the shade aside, and his body went rigid. "Frank," I said, stepping toward him cautiously. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring out the window, his mouth slightly open as though he were trying to speak but couldn't. His eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on something outside. I grabbed his shoulder and shook him, but he didn't react. Then he started to move, slowly, deliberately, toward the door. "Frank, stop!" I shouted, but it was like he couldn't hear me. He unlocked the door and stepped outside before I could stop him. The woman and I watched in horror as he walked toward the tree line, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The figure emerged from the shadows again, taller and more menacing than before. Frank stopped in front of it, his back to us, and then he was gone. One moment he was standing there, and the next, the darkness swallowed him whole. The woman let out a choked sob, and I locked the door again, my hands trembling. "We need to stay here," I said. "Whatever's out there, it can't get inside. But deep down, I wasn't sure that was true. And as the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent than before, I knew the night was far from over. It started on the first night of my move into the old house. I'd gotten a new job in a small, rural town, and the house was a rental that had been vacant for years. It wasn't much, a 2-story, weathered place on the edge of a long-forgotten road, but it had charm. Or so I thought. The landlord had been eager to find a tenant, which worked in my favor. He'd cut the rent in half, muttering something about needing someone to fill the place. I didn't think much of it at the time. The price was right, and I needed somewhere to stay. The house was far from town, surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides, with only a narrow dirt road connecting it to the main highway. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The first night, I was exhausted from unpacking. Most of my furniture hadn't arrived yet, so I was left with a mattress on the floor and a few boxes stacked in the living room. The air felt heavy, as though the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to stir it awake. I brushed it off as paranoia, the result of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Around midnight, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. A faint creaking sound, like footsteps moving slowly across old wooden floors. I froze, my ears straining to catch more. The sound stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. After a few moments, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? But the next night, it happened again. This time, the creaking was louder, more deliberate. It started in the hallway outside my bedroom and moved toward the stairs. My heart pounded as I lay in bed, clutching the covers and staring at the closed door. The footsteps stopped again, but this time, I swore I heard the faint sound of breathing. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called the landlord to ask if there were any issues with animals or intruders in the area. He hesitated before responding. "Not that I know of," he said. "You're pretty isolated out there. Could just be the wind." The wind? Sure. The third night was when things took a turn. I decided to set up a small baby monitor in the hallway, hoping to catch whatever was making the noise. It felt silly, like I was indulging in some childish ghost story, but I needed answers. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a soft static sound coming from the monitor. Groggy, I grabbed the receiver and stared at the tiny screen. At first, there was nothing. The hallway appeared empty, bathed in the faint light of the single bulb I'd left on. I was about to turn it off and go back to sleep when I saw it. A shadow, long and distorted, moving across the screen. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was too tall, its limbs too elongated. It moved with a strange, jerky rhythm, like it wasn't used to its own body. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow paused, hovering near my bedroom door. I couldn't make out details, just the unnatural shape, standing there, waiting. Then the screen went black. A loud bang jolted me upright. It sounded like it had come from downstairs. I grabbed my phone and whispered a quick call to 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained that someone might be in my house. The operator told me to stay on the line and lock myself in a room until the police arrived. I didn't need to be told twice. I locked the door and pressed my ear to it, straining to hear anything. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the creaking started again, this time closer, as though something, or someone, was ascending the stairs. I held my breath, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. A single knock followed, soft and deliberate. Then another, and another. "Ma'am? The officers are on their way," the operator said. Her voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the phone. "Stay on the line, and don't open the door for anyone but the police." The knocking stopped. The silence was worse. I couldn't hear anything now. Not footsteps, not breathing, nothing. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn at any moment. The sound of car tires crunching on gravel outside was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. The police had arrived. I stayed frozen in place as the officers called out, announcing themselves. It wasn't until I heard their voices at the top of the stairs that I dared to open the door. The hallway was empty. I told the officers everything, including what I'd seen on the monitor. They searched the house and the surrounding property, but found no signs of forced entry or anyone lurking nearby. One of them suggested it could have been a trick of the light or a shadow from outside. They were polite, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I stayed in a hotel that night. I didn't go back to the house the next day. Instead, I spent the morning at a coffee shop, scrolling through rental listings and making calls. The thought of returning to that place made my stomach churn. But as the day dragged on, I realized I couldn't just abandon my belongings. Most of what I owned was still in the house. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back during daylight, grab what I could, and leave for good. The house looked different in the sunlight. Less sinister, more like the old, run-down property I'd first seen on the rental listing. I told myself the events of the previous night had been my imagination, or, at worst, the result of an intruder who had long since fled. I entered cautiously, every creak of the floorboards setting me on edge. The house smelled stale, as though it had been holding onto its secrets in the dark. My bedroom was exactly as I'd left it, the door still slightly ajar from when the police had checked inside. The baby monitor sat on the nightstand, its screen dark. I grabbed it and shoved it into a box without looking. As I packed, I noticed something I hadn't before. Scratches on the inside of the bedroom door. They were faint but distinct, thin lines carved into the wood as though by fingernails. My stomach turned, and I hastily threw the last of my clothes into a bag. I didn't want to know what had made them. I was nearly done when I heard it again. The creaking of footsteps, faint but unmistakable. My blood turned cold as I froze in place, clutching a box of books. The sound came from downstairs, echoing through the house like a warning. My mind raced. It couldn't be a person. Not again. I had locked the doors behind me. I set the box down and crept toward the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was downstairs could hear it. From the top of the stairs, I could see into the living room, bathed in weak sunlight. It was empty, but the creaking didn't stop. It moved, slow and deliberate, from the living room toward the base of the stairs. I didn't wait to see what was coming. Grabbing my phone, I bolted back into the bedroom and locked the door. My hands trembled as I dialed the police for the second time in as many days. "There's someone in my house," I whispered. "Please, send someone quickly." As I spoke, the sound reached the top of the stairs. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. My throat tightened as I listened, the silence on the other side of the door stretching out like a noose. Then, the knocking began again, soft, rhythmic, like before. I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall, phone still clutched in my hand. The knocking grew louder, more forceful, until it turned into a series of violent bangs that rattled the door in its frame. I screamed into the phone, begging the dispatcher to send help faster. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. It wasn't coming from the hallway, it was coming from inside the room. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The corner of the room, shrouded in shadows, seemed darker than it should have been. Something was there, crouched low, its form barely distinguishable from the gloom. Two glowing eyes, yellow and inhuman, stared back at me. I froze, unable to move or speak. The thing in the corner unfolded itself, rising to an impossible height. Its limbs were grotesquely long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The guttural whispering continued, filling the room with a sound that felt like it was burrowing into my skull. The door behind me burst open, and two police officers stormed in, their shouts breaking the spell. I turned, stumbling toward them, and when I looked back, the thing was gone. The corner was empty, the air still heavy with an oppressive chill. The officers escorted me out of the house, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words felt inadequate, ridiculous even. They didn't press me for details, though. One of them glanced back at the house and muttered something about bad vibes. I never went back. I hired a moving company to retrieve my belongings, and even then, I told them to leave anything they couldn't easily grab. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I called to break the lease. "I figured you wouldn't last long," he said, his tone oddly resigned. I asked him if anything strange had ever happened in the house before, if other tenants had experienced anything similar. He paused for a long time before replying. "It's just an old house," he said finally. "They make noises." But the way he said it made me think he knew more than he was letting on. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that house, and I don't want to know. I've moved far away, into an apartment surrounded by people and noise. Sometimes, at night, I wake up to the sound of creaking floorboards and have to remind myself that I'm safe. But there's a part of me that will never forget the thing in the shadows, or the way it felt like it was waiting for me. The summer before my junior year of college, I took a job as a counselor at a sleepaway camp near a place called Ravenhill. It was deep in the woods, far from the city, and surrounded by miles of dense forest. The camp itself was old, with creaky cabins and a dining hall that smelled perpetually of burnt toast. It was the kind of place where ghost stories practically wrote themselves, and the counselors, mostly college kids like me, took full advantage of that. The kids loved the spooky campfire tales, but to me, they were just that, stories. I didn't scare easily, and I wasn't about to let a few urban legends ruin my summer. That attitude lasted exactly 1 week. It was late on a Friday night, and most of the campers were fast asleep. The other counselors and I were sitting around the campfire, swapping stories and laughing about the day's chaos. As the fire burned low, our head counselor, Maria, leaned forward, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. "Have you guys heard about the Ravenhill vanishings?" she asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I rolled my eyes. Another ghost story? Let me guess. Someone got lost in the woods and never came back? Maria smirked. Not quite. It's not just one person. Over the years, dozens of people have gone missing in these woods. Hikers, campers, even a whole family once. No trace of them was ever found. "Yeah, sure," I said, trying to keep the sarcasm in my voice. But something about her tone gave me pause. Maria wasn't the type to joke about stuff like this. "Look it up," she said, shrugging. "It's real. They say it's why the camp closed down for a few years back in the 90s. Too many kids disappearing." The group fell silent, and the cheerful energy around the fire dimmed. Someone tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but the story lingered in my mind as I walked back to my cabin that night. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but something about the idea of people vanishing without a trace left me uneasy. The next few days passed without incident. The campers kept us busy with swimming, archery, and endless requests for s'mores. But at night, when the forest grew dark and quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was my turn to do the final rounds, making sure all the cabins were locked and the campers were asleep. The air was thick with humidity, and the usual chorus of crickets and frogs seemed quieter than usual. As I walked between the cabins, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, I heard it, a faint sound, just barely audible over the rustling leaves. It was a whistle, high-pitched, distant, and strangely melodic. I froze, scanning the woods. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. The whistle stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't about to go wandering into the woods at night, but I couldn't just ignore it either. I radioed Maria, letting her know what I'd heard. "Probably one of the kids sneaking out," she said, her voice crackling through the radio. "Check it out, but don't go too far. I'll meet you in a few." Reluctantly, I stepped off the path and into the trees, my flashlight beam bouncing across the uneven ground. The whistle came again, guiding me deeper into the forest. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, maybe one of the older kids trying to scare the counselors. But the farther I went, the less certain I became. The forest felt wrong. The trees were too close, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The air was unnaturally still, and the usual sounds of the woods were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a faint light. It flickered like a candle, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity, or stupidity, won out. I crept closer, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of pine needles. As I approached the light, I realized it wasn't a candle. It was a lantern, old and rusted, hanging from a low branch. Beneath it, the ground was bare, as though someone had cleared the area on purpose. And in the center of the clearing was something that made my blood run cold. A single red backpack, half buried in the dirt. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to one of the campers, a quiet kid named Ben who hadn't shown up to dinner that night. We'd assumed he'd gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's activities. But now, staring at his backpack in the middle of the woods, I knew something was terribly wrong. "Ben?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you out here?" No response, just the oppressive silence of the forest. I took a step forward, and that's when I noticed them, footprints in the dirt. They were small, like a child's, but they weren't alone. Larger prints, spaced farther apart, trailed alongside them, leading deeper into the woods. My stomach churned. I reached for my radio, but before I could call for help, the whistle came again. This time, it was right behind me. The whistle was so close it felt like it was inside my skull. My heart pounded as I spun around, my flashlight jerking through the darkness. But there was no one there, just trees, shadows, and the faint rustling of leaves. "Ben?" I called again, my voice trembling. "This isn't funny. Come out now." Silence. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, the whistle sounded again, sharp and taunting. It sent a chill down my spine. Whatever, or whoever, was making that sound wasn't Ben. I backed away from the lantern, my flashlight trembling in my grip. My radio crackled, and Maria's voice broke the eerie stillness. "Where are you?" "I'm at the path." I fumbled to respond, my voice shaky. "I'm in the woods, near the clearing. I found Ben's backpack, but I think someone's out here." "Stay where you are," Maria ordered. "I'm coming to you." I didn't argue. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for movement, but the shadows seemed alive, shifting and swaying as if something lurked just out of sight. The footprints in the dirt felt like a warning, a silent message. "You're not alone." Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every sound amplified in the suffocating silence. Finally, Maria's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I nearly collapsed with relief. She jogged into the clearing, her expression grim. "Where's Ben?" she asked, her eyes darting to the backpack. "I don't know," I said. "I heard something. A whistle. It's been moving around me." Maria's face darkened, and she bent down to examine the backpack. "We need to get back to camp," she said, standing abruptly. "Now." "But what about Ben?" I asked, glancing at the footprints. "We can't just leave him out here." Maria hesitated, her jaw tightening. "We'll call the rangers, but we need to leave. It's not safe." Before I could argue, the whistle came again, closer than ever. It echoed through the trees, a chilling melody that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Maria grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the path. "Move," she hissed. We ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. The forest seemed to close in around us, the branches clawing at our clothes. Behind us, the whistle followed, growing louder and more urgent. As we broke through the tree-line and onto the main path, the whistle abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Maria and I slowed, gasping for air, but neither of us spoke. The camp was just ahead, its lights barely visible through the trees. Safety was so close, yet it felt impossibly far. And then we heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and coming from the path behind us. Maria's eyes met mine, wide with fear. "Run," she whispered. We sprinted toward the camp, the sound of the footsteps growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what I might see. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep going. We burst into the clearing where the cabins stood, the warm glow of the campfire still flickering in the distance. The other counselors looked up in alarm as we barreled into the group, gasping and frantic. "What happened?" one of them asked, but Maria didn't answer. She grabbed the camp phone and dialed the local ranger station, her hands shaking as she explained what we'd found. Within 20 minutes, the Rangers arrived, their powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness as they headed into the woods. They instructed us to gather all the campers and keep them in the dining hall until further notice. No one was allowed to leave the building. The mood in the dining hall was tense, the campers whispering nervously while the counselors tried to stay calm. I couldn't shake the image of Ben's backpack in the clearing, or the sound of that whistle following us through the forest. Hours passed before the Rangers returned, their faces grim. They had found no sign of Ben. The footprints we'd seen in the clearing led deeper into the woods, but disappeared near a creek. The lantern was gone too, as though it had never been there. One of the Rangers pulled Maria and me aside. "You did the right thing by leaving when you did," he said, his voice low. "But if you hear that whistle again, get out immediately." "Why?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "What is it?" The Ranger hesitated, glancing at his partner before answering. "Over the years, we've gotten reports of people hearing a whistle in these woods. Hikers, campers, they all describe the same thing. Footsteps, strange lights, and a feeling of being followed. And then they vanish." Maria and I exchanged a look, both of us pale. "What do you think it is?" she asked. The Ranger shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not something you want to mess with." That night, I didn't sleep. Neither did Maria. We stayed up, watching the forest from the safety of the dining hall windows, jumping at every rustle and creak. The campers left the next morning, their parents arriving early after hearing about the missing boy. The camp shut down for good that summer. Ben was never found, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that whistle, distant and haunting, as if it's calling me back to Raven Hill. My high school had always been a little odd. Built in the 1920s, it was a sprawling structure of brick and stone with countless renovations over the years that created a labyrinth of hallways, dead ends, and forgotten rooms. The strangest part of the building, though, was the old auditorium. It hadn't been used in decades, ever since the school built a newer, larger auditorium on the opposite side of the campus. The old auditorium was locked up tight, its heavy wooden doors chained and padlocked. Most of the students didn't even think about it, but for those of us who stayed late for extracurriculars, it was hard to ignore the eerie feeling it gave off. The doors were just down the hall from the art room, where I spent most of my time after school working on projects. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of someone, or something, through the frosted glass windows. A trick of the light, I told myself, though it never stopped the shiver that ran down my spine. One Friday evening, I stayed late to finish a mural for the upcoming pep rally. The art room was empty except for me and Clara, my best friend and partner in crime. Clara was the bold one between us, always looking for trouble, or at least, an adventure. "We should check it out," Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence as she dipped her brush into a jar of paint. "Check what out?" I asked, though I already knew. "The old auditorium," she said, grinning. "I've been dying to see what's inside. It's probably just a bunch of old props and dusty chairs, but still." I shook my head. "It's locked. And even if it wasn't, Mr. Carpenter would kill us if he caught us snooping around." She rolled her eyes. "Come on, Riley. You've been staring at that door for years. Don't you want to know what's in there?" Of course I did. The locked auditorium had been a mystery for as long as I could remember. There were rumors about it, of course, whispers of accidents, fires, and even a student who had vanished during a rehearsal decades ago. Most of it was probably made up, but the idea of finally uncovering the truth was tempting. "All right," I said reluctantly, "but if we get caught, I'm blaming you." Clara had come prepared, of course. From her backpack, she pulled out a hairpin and set to work on the padlock. I kept watch, my heart pounding as I scanned the hallway for any sign of a teacher or janitor. After a few tense minutes, there was a soft click, and Clara turned to me with a triumphant grin. "After you," she said, pushing the door open. The air inside was heavy with the smell of mildew and dust. We stepped into the darkness, our footsteps echoing off the hardwood floor. Clara flicked on her phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal rows of old wooden chairs, a crumbling stage, and thick curtains that hung like ghosts on either side. "This place is massive," Clara whispered, her voice tinged with awe. I nodded, taking it all in. The auditorium was eerily intact, as if frozen in time. Broken light fixtures dangled from the ceiling, and a grand piano sat abandoned near the stage, its lid propped open. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here. Not in the sense of rules, but something deeper, something wrong. Clara moved toward the stage, her flashlight sweeping across the walls. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a faded mural painted on the back wall. It depicted a scene of students performing under a spotlight, but the paint had cracked and peeled, giving the figures an unsettling, distorted appearance. "What do you think happened here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who knows?" Clara said, "but I bet we're about to find out." She climbed onto the stage, the old boards creaking under her weight. I stayed near the back, my unease growing with every second. Clara wandered over to the piano, lifting the heavy lid. She pressed a key, and the sound that followed wasn't music. It was a groan, deep and mournful, as if the piano itself was crying out. "Okay, that's enough," I said, my nerves finally getting the better of me. "Let's go." Clara ignored me, her flashlight aimed at something behind the curtain. "Wait, there's something back here. Clara, come on." I hissed, but she disappeared behind the heavy fabric. I stood frozen, torn between leaving and going after her. The seconds stretched into an eternity, and then I heard it, a faint whisper, low and unintelligible. It wasn't Clara's voice. "Clara?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The whispering grew louder, joined by the sound of something heavy sliding across the floor. My hands shook as I raised my phone, the weak light barely piercing the darkness. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the stage and pushed through the curtain. Behind it was chaos. Broken props and tangled wires littered the floor, and the whispering grew louder, like a dozen voices speaking over each other. Clara was nowhere to be seen. "Clara!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. A loud bang echoed through the auditorium, and the stage lights flickered to life, bathing the room in an eerie, yellow glow. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and writhing as if alive. And there, at the center of the stage, stood a figure. A tall silhouette cloaked in darkness. It wasn't Clara. The figure turned its head slowly, as if sensing my presence. Though I couldn't make out its features, I felt its gaze, cold and piercing. My legs felt like lead, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then, the figure stepped forward. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, each one sending a hollow echo through the auditorium. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, the edge of the stage pressing into my legs. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, angular limbs that seemed to stretch with every step. "Clara?" I called out, my voice trembling, though I knew it wasn't her. "Is that you?" It didn't answer. The shadows around it seemed to ripple and shift, as if the figure itself was pulling them closer, wrapping itself in darkness. The whispering grew louder, the overlapping voices now forming a single word that repeated over and over. "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. Turning, I bolted for the stairs at the side of the stage, my feet barely touching the creaking wood as I ran. Behind me, the whispers turned to a guttural growl, and the sound of something heavy sliding across the stage followed close behind. "Clara!" I shouted again, hoping desperately for an answer. As I reached the floor, I risked a glance back. The figure stood at the edge of the stage, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me. It didn't chase me, but the oppressive feeling of its gaze was enough to drive me forward. I reached the aisle, weaving between rows of old, dusty chairs, when I saw her. Clara was slumped against the far wall near one of the emergency exits, her flashlight flickering weakly in her hand. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Clara!" I ran to her side, dropping to my knees. "Are you okay? What happened?" She didn't respond right away, her gaze fixed on something behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see the figure, but the stage was empty. The lights had dimmed again, and the shadows seemed to retreat back into the corners of the room. "We need to go," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not safe." I helped her to her feet, her legs trembling as we made our way to the door. The handle was rusted, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it wouldn't budge. But with a hard shove, it gave way, and we stumbled into the cool night air. We didn't stop until we were halfway across the parking lot. The school loomed behind us, dark and silent, the old auditorium hidden away like a secret it wanted to keep. Clara collapsed onto a bench, her breaths coming in short gasps. "What happened back there?" I asked, crouching in front of her. "What did you see?" She shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. I don't know. I was behind the curtain, looking at some old props, and then I felt something. Like someone was right behind me." Her voice broke, and she glanced back toward the school, her eyes filled with fear. I turned around, and it was there. That thing. It didn't move, but I couldn't look away. It whispered something, but I don't know what it said. I shivered, remembering the overlapping voices I'd heard. "We shouldn't have gone in there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever that thing is, it doesn't want us there." The next day, Clara didn't come to school. I texted her, but she didn't respond. When I stopped by her house after class, her mom told me she wasn't feeling well and didn't want to see anyone. Something about her tone made me uneasy, but I didn't press the issue. That night, I dreamed of the auditorium. I was back on the stage, the air heavy with the smell of dust and mildew. The figure was there, standing in the center, its blank face turned toward me. The shadows writhed around it, and the whispers filled my head, louder and more insistent. "Leave, leave, leave." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, half expecting it to be Clara. But the message wasn't from her. It was an unknown number. "Unknown. You should have stayed away." My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. I blocked the number immediately, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that the message wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. Clara never came back to school. Her family moved away a few weeks later, and no one seemed to know why. I tried to forget about what happened, but the dreams continued, each one more vivid than the last. The whispers grew louder, the figure standing closer each time. One evening, months later, I drove past the school on my way home. The lights in the old auditorium were on, casting an eerie glow through the frosted windows. I pulled over, my heart racing as I stared at the building. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow passing behind the glass. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. I drove away. The image burned into my mind. Whatever was in that auditorium hadn't forgotten us. And I knew, deep down, that it never would. To this day, I avoid the school. I've tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the whispers and the figure were nothing more than tricks of the light and my overactive imagination. But sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of footsteps echoing through my house. And I know it's still watching, waiting. It started as just another after-school obligation. I was part of the drama club, and we were rehearsing for our upcoming spring play. The rehearsals usually wrapped up by 6 p.m., but that evening ran long. Our director, Mrs. Grant, was determined to perfect one particular scene, and by the time we finished, it was nearly 7:30 p.m. The school felt different at that hour, quieter, darker, and oddly oppressive. The usually bustling halls were deserted, and the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than normal. "All right, that's a wrap for today," Mrs. Grant called out as we began packing up. "Be careful heading home, everyone." Most of the group left in a rush, eager to get out of the building. I lingered behind, tasked with putting away some props in the old storage area beneath the stage. The school's auditorium was massive, built decades ago, with a basement level that served as a storage space for old sets, costumes, and equipment. As the last of my friends waved goodbye, I hesitated. The storage area had always creeped me out, but I didn't want to shirk my responsibilities. I grabbed the box of props and headed down the narrow staircase behind the stage. The air grew colder as I descended, and the dim light from the single bulb above barely illuminated the cluttered basement. Rows of old furniture and forgotten stage pieces cast long, eerie shadows against the walls. I placed the box on a shelf and was about to leave when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze. It sounded like someone lightly drumming their fingers on wood, coming from deeper in the basement. I told myself it was probably just the old pipes, or maybe something settling. But then the tapping changed, growing faster and louder, as though whatever was making the noise wanted me to hear it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, kept me rooted in place. I grabbed the flashlight from the wall and shone it toward the far end of the basement. The beam illuminated rows of old furniture covered in dusty white sheets. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the oppressive feeling in the air grew stronger. My heart raced as I took a cautious step forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. This time, I heard something new, a faint shuffling sound, like feet dragging across the concrete floor. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing but empty space. My stomach churned, and a chill ran down my spine. I decided I had had enough. Turning on my heel, I hurried back toward the stairs. But just as I reached them, the lights went out. Panic surged through me as I stood in total darkness, the faint beam of my flashlight the only source of light. I fumbled for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. That's when I heard it again, the shuffling sound, but this time it was closer. I shone the flashlight wildly around the room, its weak light barely piercing the inky blackness. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, almost as if they were alive. My breath caught as the beam landed on something, a figure standing at the far end of the basement, partially obscured by the draped furniture. It wasn't moving. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, its silhouette hunched and distorted. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I took a step back, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, as though studying me. I backed up further, keeping the light trained on the figure. My foot caught on something, a loose board or a stray piece of furniture, and I stumbled, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, and the beam spun wildly, casting erratic shadows across the room. By the time I grabbed it again, the figure was gone. I scrambled up the stairs, not daring to look back. The moment I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut and bolted it. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the lock. The auditorium was empty, its vast space eerily silent. The only sound was my ragged breathing. I knew I needed to leave, but as I turned toward the exit, the intercom crackled to life. "Attention staff and students," the principal's voice echoed through the empty halls. "The school is now under lockdown. This is not a drill." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, torn between fear and disbelief. Who would call a lockdown this late? The building was practically empty. Then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps on the stage above me. Slow, deliberate, and growing louder. The footsteps echoed through the vast auditorium, each step deliberate and unhurried. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed myself against the wall near the basement door, desperate to stay out of sight. Whoever, or whatever, was up there wasn't trying to hide their presence. They wanted me to know they were there. I gripped the flashlight tightly, its beam flickering as though sensing my fear. I knew I needed to move, but every muscle in my body screamed at me to stay put. The footsteps grew louder, heading toward the edge of the stage. I dared a glance and instantly regretted it. A figure stood at the edge of the stage, half lit by the dim emergency lights. It was the same one I'd seen in the basement, tall, thin, and impossibly hunched, its movements jerky and unnatural. The faint glow cast eerie shadows over its distorted frame, making it seem like it was shifting between solid and shadow. The figure tilted its head, as if it could see me despite the darkness. Then it moved, stepping off the stage without a sound. My breath hitched. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted for the side exit of the auditorium, my footsteps echoing as I ran. The moment I pushed through the heavy double doors, I was hit by the oppressive silence of the hallway. The school felt like a tomb. I needed to get out of the building, but the lockdown meant all the exits were locked and reinforced. I had to find another way. My mind raced as I tried to think of a plan. The gymnasium had an emergency exit with a breakaway latch. If I could make it there, I might have a chance. I turned down the hallway, my shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Behind me, I heard it again. Those footsteps, impossibly slow yet unrelenting. I forced myself to keep moving, fighting the urge to look back. The lights overhead flickered as I ran, plunging the corridor into brief bouts of darkness. It felt like the shadows were closing in around me, chasing me alongside the sound of those deliberate steps. I reached the gym doors and shoved them open, slipping inside. The vast space felt cavernous and cold, the bleachers casting long, menacing shadows. My eyes darted toward the emergency exit at the far end of the gym. It felt impossibly far away. Halfway across the gym floor, I froze. The figure was standing in the corner of the room, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving, just watching. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon and forced myself to keep walking. With each step I took, the figure seemed to grow closer, though it never moved. My pulse pounded in my ears as I neared the emergency exit. When I reached it, I grabbed the latch and pulled. The door groaned but didn't open. "No," I whispered, panic surging through me. I pulled again, harder this time, but the latch wouldn't budge. Behind me, the figure's shadow stretched across the floor, impossibly long and distorted. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered, low and echoing. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure was gone, but the shadow remained, pooling unnaturally on the gym floor. It stretched toward me like ink spilling across the ground. I backed against the door, my breathing ragged. Then I heard it, the sound of heavy metal creaking. The latch gave way, and the emergency door burst open behind me. I stumbled outside into the cool night air, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I looked back. The shadow was spilling out of the gym, stretching across the pavement like a living thing. I turned and ran, the school's towering silhouette looming behind me. When I reached the edge of the parking lot, I saw flashing blue and red lights. A police car pulled up, and an officer stepped out, his flashlight sweeping the area. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words tumbled out incoherently. He radioed for backup and stayed with me as we waited. When the other officers arrived, they searched the school thoroughly. They found nothing. No sign of the figure, no explanation for the strange lockdown. The security cameras had captured nothing unusual, and the shadow that had followed me was gone. The police chalked it up to stress, maybe exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I didn't return to school for a week, and when I finally did, I couldn't bring myself to step into the auditorium again. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that figure. Silent, distorted, and unrelenting. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I dream about it. I wake up with the sound of footsteps echoing in my ears and the feeling of eyes watching me from the darkness. And no matter how many times I tell myself it's over, a part of me knows the truth. It's still out there, waiting. The job was simple: clean out the old farmhouse. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Harrington, had recently passed away, and his family hired me to clear the place before they decided what to do with it. I worked for a small moving and cleaning company, and we often took on odd jobs like this, especially in rural areas where few were willing to travel. The farmhouse was a few miles outside of town, down a gravel road that seemed to stretch forever into the horizon. When I arrived, the place looked exactly how you'd expect an abandoned farmhouse to look. Weathered wood siding, a sagging porch, and windows that seemed to hold back secrets rather than light. The family had told me the house had been empty for years, as Mr. Harrington had been living in a nursing home. Still, they warned me to expect a lifetime of junk inside. The first few hours went by uneventfully. I worked through the main living areas, sorting through stacks of dusty books, old furniture, and knickknacks that felt like relics of another era. There were faded photographs on the walls, yellowed with age, showing stern-faced people in stiff poses. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and abandonment. It wasn't until I reached the second floor that things started to feel wrong. The upstairs hallway was lined with closed doors. I started with the first one, which led to a small bedroom filled with boxes. The second door opened into a bathroom with a cracked mirror and a clawfoot tub. The third door was locked. That wasn't unusual in jobs like this. Sometimes old locks got jammed, or keys were long lost. I decided to move on and come back to it later. But as I worked my way through the other rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in the house seemed to stretch longer than they should have, and every creak of the floorboards felt deliberate, as though someone, or something, was matching my movements. By the time I returned to the locked door, the sun was beginning to set. The house grew darker, and the air seemed colder. I decided to try the door one last time, jiggling the handle and giving it a firm push. To my surprise, it opened with a groan, revealing a staircase leading up to an attic. I hesitated. The attic hadn't been mentioned in the job description, but I knew I couldn't leave without checking it. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the creaky stairs, the beam cutting through the darkness. At the top, the attic was almost completely empty, save for a single rocking chair positioned near the far wall. It faced a small, grimy window that looked out onto the overgrown fields behind the house. The chair swayed slightly, though there was no breeze to explain its movement. I stepped closer, my flashlight catching something on the floor beneath the chair. A ring of salt, faint and uneven, as though it had been there for years. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. Who had put it there? And why? I turned to leave, but as I stepped back toward the stairs, I felt a strange sensation, like a static charge prickling at my skin. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and I heard a faint sound, like the rustle of fabric. Slowly, I turned back toward the chair. It was rocking, not a gentle sway like before, but a steady, deliberate motion, as though someone invisible had just sat down. I don't remember running down the stairs, but the next thing I knew, I was back in the hallway, slamming the attic door shut behind me. My heart was pounding, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but when I looked at the screen, it was glitching, the display flickering between static and random, unreadable symbols. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the job or the remaining clutter. Grabbing my tools, I headed for the front door. As I passed the old photographs on the wall, I froze. The faces in the pictures had changed. What had once been stern expressions were now twisted into something unnatural. Their eyes seemed to follow me, their mouths curling into smiles that were too wide, too sharp. One photograph near the stairs showed a family standing outside the farmhouse. But now, in the background of the image, there was a figure in the attic window, a dark silhouette with glowing eyes. I didn't stop to think. I bolted out the door, into the fading light of dusk. I could still feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, even as I reached my truck and sped down the gravel road. When I got back to town, I called my boss and told him I couldn't finish the job. He wasn't happy, but I didn't care. That night, as I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it had all been in my head, I heard something outside my window, a faint creaking sound, like a rocking chair swaying in the breeze. The creaking sound outside my window sent a chill down my spine. I lived in a second-story apartment, far from anything that could make such a noise. Heart pounding, I forced myself to get out of bed and peer through the blinds. The street below was quiet, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. Nothing moved, but as I stared into the empty night, I felt it again. That same oppressive heaviness I'd felt in the attic. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, pressing against the glass, watching me. I let the blinds fall shut and backed away, trying to shake the feeling. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Nothing followed me from that house. It couldn't have. I didn't sleep that night. The creaking sound returned every few minutes, always faint but deliberate, as if to remind me it was still there. By dawn, it had stopped, but the uneasy feeling remained. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I needed answers. The next day, I drove to the town's public library. It was the kind of small, quiet place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, But the librarian was helpful when I mentioned the Harrington house. Her expression shifted when I brought it up, her friendly demeanor giving way to something more guarded. "You're not the first person to ask about that place," she said, lowering her voice. "There's a lot of history there. Most of it unpleasant." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity outweighing my fear. She hesitated before pulling a dusty folder from the archives. Inside were old newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and handwritten notes. The articles dated back decades, detailing a series of strange occurrences tied to the house. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, and sightings of a shadowy figure were common themes. One article mentioned a family who had lived there in the 1940s, only to vanish without a trace. The only clue left behind was a single rocking chair in the attic. Another clipping described a young couple who rented the house in the 1980s. They claimed to hear footsteps and whispers at night, and one of them reported seeing a figure sitting in the rocking chair, its face hidden in shadow. They moved out after only 3 weeks. The most unsettling piece was a handwritten note, dated 5 years ago. It had been left anonymously with the library's historical society and read, "The house doesn't just hold onto the past, it collects it. If you see the chair move, leave. If it follows you, pray." The librarian watched me carefully as I read. "If you're dealing with something from that house," she said softly, "I suggest you leave it alone. Don't go back. Whatever's there, it doesn't let go easily." I nodded, thanking her, though her words offered little comfort. The idea that something from that house had latched onto me was unbearable, but the strange occurrences I'd experienced made it hard to deny. I drove home feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, the creaking sound returned. This time, it wasn't faint. It was louder, more deliberate, and it wasn't outside. It was in my living room. I froze, my mind racing. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was the building settling or a neighbor's noise bleeding through the walls. But deep down, I knew better. Grabbing my phone, I crept toward the sound, my footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. The living room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. The rocking chair. It was the same chair from the Harrington house, though I hadn't brought it with me. It swayed gently, its wooden frame creaking with each slow motion. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was something sitting in it, a shadowy figure, its outline faint but unmistakable. Its head tilted slightly, as though it were watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table, and ran to the door. As I fumbled with the lock, a deep, guttural whisper filled the room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, mocking, taunting. The chair creaked faster now, as though the figure were laughing at my fear. I flung the door open and ran outside, not stopping until I was halfway down the block. Only then did I dare to look back. My apartment window was dark, but I could still hear the creaking sound, faint and rhythmic, echoing in the still night air. I didn't go back. I stayed with a friend for the next few days, explaining my situation as vaguely as possible. They thought I was just stressed or overtired, but they let me stay without question. When I finally worked up the courage to return, the rocking chair was gone. The apartment looked normal, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. I quit my job with the cleaning company and moved to another town within a month. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that house is still out there, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of creaking wood, and I wonder if it's finally found me again. Because some things don't let go. They just wait. And when they return, they make sure you never forget. The summer before my senior year of high school, my friends and I became obsessed with urban exploration. Abandoned buildings, forgotten factories, overgrown parks. We loved the thrill of sneaking into places no one else dared to go. It felt like a game, a test of courage. But our fascination with the eerie and unknown led us to a place we should have never entered, the old Fairmont Asylum. The asylum sat on the outskirts of town, hidden behind a wall of dense trees. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Local legends claimed it was haunted, and people swore they heard screams coming from the grounds late at night. Of course, we didn't believe any of that. To us, it was just another challenge, another place to conquer. One humid Saturday night, my best friend Eric convinced the rest of us, me, Lily, and Marcus, to check it out. "Come on," he said, grinning like he always did when he had a bad idea. "It's just an old building. We'll be in and out in an hour." Lily was hesitant. "You know people say that place is cursed, right? They found bodies there." "Urban legends," Eric scoffed. "Besides, if you're too scared, you can stay home." Lily rolled her eyes. "Fine, but if I hear anything creepy, I'm out." Marcus and I exchanged nervous glances, but didn't say anything. Eric was the kind of guy you didn't argue with. If he wanted to go, we were all going. We arrived at the asylum around midnight, parking Eric's car on the side of the dirt road leading to the property. The building loomed ahead, its crumbling facade partially hidden by overgrown vines. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if the place itself didn't want us there. "Let's go," Eric said, leading the way. He brought a crowbar to pry open the rusted gate, and with a few grunts, he managed to push it open. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed into the night, setting my nerves on edge. We stepped onto the cracked pavement of what used to be the asylum's main driveway. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees, and our flashlights cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance in the darkness. As we approached the main entrance, the air grew colder, and I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. The doors were boarded up, but Eric, ever the problem solver, found an open window on the side of the building. One by one, we climbed through, landing in what appeared to be an old waiting room. The air inside was stale, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic hung in the air. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Lily whispered, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. "Relax," Eric said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "It's just a building. Let's check out the main hall." The waiting room opened into a long, dark corridor lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but a few hung open, revealing empty rooms filled with decaying furniture and peeling wallpaper. Our footsteps echoed eerily as we moved deeper into the asylum. "Look at this," Marcus said, stopping to examine a rusted wheelchair sitting in the middle of the hallway. "It's like something out of a horror movie." Lily shivered. "Can we not talk about horror movies while we're in a place like this?" "Fine, scaredy cat," Eric teased, grinning as he led us farther down the hall. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Strange stains marked the walls, and our flashlights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. At one point, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, too quiet to make out. But when I turned to look, no one else seemed to notice. We reached a large double door with a faded sign above it that read, Ward C. Eric pushed the doors open, and they creaked loudly, the sound echoing like a scream. Inside was a large, open room filled with rusted beds and overturned furniture. Graffiti covered the walls, but beneath the spray paint, faint marks were etched into the plaster. They looked like scratches, as though someone had clawed at the walls in desperation. "This is messed up," Marcus said, his voice low. "People lived here." "Yeah, and now they don't," Eric replied, walking toward the center of the room. "Come on, let's see if we can find the basement." "Why the basement?" Lily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because that's where they kept the really crazy stuff," Eric said with a grin. "Or so they say." I didn't like the sound of that, but I followed the group as we made our way toward a staircase at the far end of the room. The steps were narrow and steep, and the air grew colder with each step we descended. The flashlight beams seemed weaker, barely cutting through the darkness. My unease grew with every creak of the old stairs. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a narrow corridor lined with doors, each one secured with heavy locks and rusted chains. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and words scratched into the paint. I ran my fingers over one, trying to make sense of it, but it didn't look like anything I recognized. "This is where they kept the patients they couldn't control," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The really dangerous ones." "Why would you know that?" Lily asked, her voice sharp with anxiety. "I read about it online," Eric replied. "They say some of them never left." A chill ran down my spine. What's that supposed to mean? Eric shrugged. People claim this place is haunted, that the patient's spirits are still here, trapped or whatever. It's just stories. Let's hope so, Marcus muttered, shining his flashlight on one of the doors. That's when we heard it, a faint sound, coming from somewhere farther down the corridor. It was soft at first, almost like breathing, but it grew louder with each passing second. A low, guttural noise that sent a wave of terror through me. We froze, our flashlights flickering wildly. Did you hear that? Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, a loud bang echoed down the hall, as though something heavy had slammed against one of the doors. My blood turned to ice. Time to go, I said, turning toward the stairs. But before I could take a step, the noise came again, this time closer. The noise came again, reverberating through the narrow corridor. A loud, metallic bang that made my heart feel like it had stopped entirely. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, as if something, or someone, was trying to get our attention. Let's get out of here, I said, my voice trembling. Eric hesitated, his flashlight beam sweeping over the chained doors. It's probably just the wind, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. That's not the wind. Lily snapped. We need to go. Now. Another bang cut through the air, louder this time, and it was followed by something worse. A dragging sound. It was faint at first, like metal scraping against the floor, but it grew louder with each passing second. My stomach churned as I realized it was coming from the far end of the corridor, just beyond the edge of our flashlight beams. Run, I whispered, backing toward the stairs. Before anyone could respond, Marcus's flashlight flickered and died, plunging us deeper into darkness. Damn it, he cursed, smacking the side of it uselessly. Stop wasting time. Lily hissed, already moving toward the stairs. I grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him along as we stumbled back toward the way we came. Eric lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on the end of the corridor where the noise was coming from. What are you doing? I shouted. Move. Reluctantly, he turned and followed us up the stairs, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The dragging sound grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural moan that didn't sound human. My legs burned as I climbed, but I didn't dare slow down. We burst into the main level of the asylum, gasping for breath. The oppressive silence of the upper floors was almost a relief compared to the sounds from below. But we weren't safe yet. Where's the window we came through? Marcus asked, panic creeping into his voice. This way, Eric said, leading us back toward the waiting room. The path through the asylum felt longer than it should have, every shadow in the decrepit halls feeling like it was watching us. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shape slipping into one of the side rooms. I didn't stop to check. When we finally reached the waiting room, we froze. The window we had climbed through earlier was gone, boarded up from the outside with what looked like fresh wood. My heart sank. What the hell? Marcus said, his voice cracking. It wasn't like this before. Someone's messing with us, Lily said, her voice trembling. Eric cursed under his breath, spinning around. There's another way out. There has to be. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall behind us, slow and deliberate. They weren't running, but they were getting closer. They're coming, Lily whispered, clutching my arm. We need to hide, Eric said, pulling open the door to a small office off the waiting room. We scrambled inside, shutting the door quietly behind us. The room was cramped, filled with dusty filing cabinets and broken furniture. There was barely enough space for all four of us to fit. Eric turned off his flashlight, and the room plunged into darkness. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the faint creak of footsteps outside. They were close now, just beyond the door. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a voice, a low, distorted whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was chilling, like someone muttering under their breath. The footsteps stopped right outside the office door. My heart felt like it was going to burst. I clutched Lily's hand, my knuckles white. No one dared to move. The doorknob rattled. Lily let out a small gasp, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. Whoever, or whatever, was outside didn't open the door, but they didn't leave either. The rattling stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Heavy, raspy breathing, as though the person, or thing, outside was struggling for air. The sound went on for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only seconds. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Until the door slammed open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint light from the hall. It was tall and hunched, its limbs unnaturally long. I couldn't see its face, but its head tilted unnaturally, as if it was studying us. Lily screamed, and the thing lunged forward. Eric grabbed the broken leg of a chair and swung it wildly, the wood cracking against the figure's arm. It recoiled with an inhuman shriek, the sound piercing and deafening. "Run!" Eric shouted, shoving us toward the hallway. We didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted through the asylum, the thing's shrieks echoing behind us. Every door and window we passed seemed sealed shut, as though the building itself was trying to trap us. Finally, we stumbled into what looked like an old storage room. To our relief, one of the windows was broken, the glass shards glinting in the moonlight. Without hesitation, we climbed through, cutting our hands on the jagged edges. We hit the ground outside and ran without looking back. The forest felt like a maze, but eventually, we found the dirt road and Eric's car. We piled in, slamming the doors shut. Eric floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped away. No one spoke during the drive back. When we finally reached town, we sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what had happened. The next day, we told ourselves we'd imagined it, that our fear had gotten the better of us. But none of us ever went back to the asylum. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that distorted whisper, faint but unmistakable, echoing in the back of my mind. It started as a rumor, one of those things that every high school has. A story passed around in hushed whispers, gaining traction with each retelling. At my school, it was about a room that didn't exist on any map or blueprint of the building. They called it Room Zero, a name that sounded both absurd and ominous. The story went that Room Zero had once been used for something sinister, though the details varied depending on who told it. Some said it was an old storage area where a teacher had gone missing decades ago. Others claimed it was a makeshift detention room where kids were locked up as punishment until one of them died. Regardless of the version, everyone agreed on one thing. The room was hidden deep in the basement, and you couldn't find it unless it wanted you to. I never believed any of it. I figured it was just another urban legend designed to spook freshmen. That is, until the night I saw it for myself. It was late in the fall semester, and I'd stayed after school to help with the setup for a charity event. The basement of our school was used for storage and maintenance, and we'd been sent down to grab some tables and chairs. There were 3 of us, me, Ethan, and Kara. Ethan was the one who brought up the rumor. "So," he said as we navigated the dimly lit stairs, "you guys ever hear about Room Zero?" I groaned. "Not this again. It's just a dumb story, Ethan." "No, it's real," he insisted, his voice lowering dramatically. "My cousin swears he saw it when he went here. He said it's hidden somewhere in the basement." "Your cousin also thinks Bigfoot is real," Kara shot back, rolling her eyes. "Let's just grab the tables and get out of here." The basement was colder than the rest of the school, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and metal. Rows of old lockers lined the walls, their paint peeling and rusted hinges creaking when the occasional draft moved through. The light fixtures buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow. As we moved deeper into the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, and the faint hum of the lights felt louder, almost like a low, droning whisper. "Okay, this is weird," Ethan said, stopping suddenly. "The storage room is supposed to be right here." I looked around. He was right. The narrow hallway we were in ended abruptly in a blank wall. There was no sign of the storage room we'd been sent to find. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Kara said, though her voice sounded uncertain. "Let's go back." We retraced our steps, But the basement felt different now, like the layout had shifted when we weren't looking. Hallways that should have led back to the stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, and doors we'd passed earlier were now missing. The buzzing lights grew louder, their flickering casting erratic shadows on the walls. "This isn't funny," Kara said, her voice rising. "Ethan, if this is some kind of prank—" "It's not," he snapped, his face pale. "I don't even know where we are." Neither did I. The air felt heavier, colder, and the faint smell of mildew was now overpowered by something sharper, like burned plastic. My chest tightened as we turned another corner and saw it. A door at the end of the hallway. The door was plain, unmarked, and slightly ajar. Faint light spilled out from the crack, illuminating the floor in front of it. None of us moved. "Is that—" Ethan started, but his voice trailed off. "Room 0. It had to be. The very thing we'd been joking about minutes earlier now stood before us, as real as the floor beneath our feet. "This isn't funny," Kara repeated, though now she sounded more scared than angry. "We need to leave." "Wait," Ethan said, stepping toward the door. "What if it's not? What if it's just a maintenance room or something?" "Then someone else can find out," Kara snapped. "Let's go." But Ethan didn't listen. He moved closer, his hand reaching out to push the door open. "Ethan, don't!" I hissed, but it was too late. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing a dark, windowless room. The light we'd seen was coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though disturbed by some unseen force. The room was small, empty except for a single wooden chair in the center. The chair faced the far wall, and though there was nothing remarkable about it, my skin crawled just looking at it. "What the hell is this place?" Ethan whispered, stepping inside. "Don't go in there," Kara pleaded, grabbing my arm as though to stop me from following him. But Ethan didn't stop. He moved toward the chair, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the tiny room. I wanted to pull him back, to drag him out of there, but I couldn't move. Something about the room felt wrong, like it was alive and watching us. Ethan reached the chair and hesitated. Then, slowly, he turned it around. The chair was empty, but the moment he touched it, the light bulb flickered violently. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. "Ethan!" Kara screamed, rushing to the door. She pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. "Ethan, are you okay?" I shouted, my voice shaking. There was no response. The light beneath the door dimmed, then disappeared entirely. The buzzing sound in the basement grew louder, morphing into something low and guttural, like distant growls. "Ethan!" Kara cried again, but the door remained sealed, and the sounds grew louder. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The light flickered back on beneath the door, and with a loud click, it swung open on its own. The room was empty. The room was empty. Kara and I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the space where Ethan had been just moments before. The chair still sat in the center of the room, its wooden surface scuffed and scratched, but there was no sign of Ethan. "Where is he?" Kara whispered, her voice trembling. "Where the hell did he go?" "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. My hands shook as I stepped inside, my eyes scanning every corner of the small, barren space. There was no other door, no window, no way he could have left. It was like he'd simply vanished. The light bulb overhead flickered again, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I felt the air grow heavier, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "We need to leave," Kara said, grabbing my arm. Her nails dug into my skin, but I didn't care. "We need to get out of here. Now." I nodded, stepping back toward the door. But just as we turned to leave, the light bulb swung violently, casting the room into disorienting flashes of light and shadow. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. It felt like the room itself was alive, angry that we were leaving. Then the door slammed shut behind us. Kara screamed, pounding on the heavy wood, but it didn't budge. I tried the handle, twisting and pulling with all my strength, but it was locked tight. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, and the shadows on the walls began to twist and move, forming shapes that weren't ours. "Riley, do something," Kara cried, her voice breaking. I had no idea what to do. Panic clawed at my mind as I turned back toward the room. That's when I saw it. The chair wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat there, hunched and motionless, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The light flickered, making it impossible to see its face, but I didn't need to. The air around it was suffocating, thick with a malevolent energy that made every instinct in my body scream to get away. "Kara," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum. "Don't turn around." But it was too late. She did, and the scream that tore from her throat was unlike anything I'd ever heard. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror, and tripped over the edge of the doorway. I caught her just before she fell, pulling her close as the figure began to rise. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring our fear. The shadows writhed around it, curling and twisting like living things. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, blank surface where one should have been, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, as though it was staring directly into my soul. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." Kara didn't argue. Together, we threw ourselves at the door, pounding and kicking with everything we had. The figure stepped closer, its long, spindly limbs almost grazing the floor. The air grew colder with each step, freezing our breaths in the dim light. Finally, the door gave way with a loud crack, and we tumbled into the hallway. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing Kara's hand and pulling her with me as we ran. The basement was different now, longer, darker, the walls twisting and stretching like the room we'd just escaped. The hum followed us, growing louder with every step. Behind us, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, like the figure was taking its time. "Don't look back," I shouted, gripping Kara's hand tightly. We rounded a corner, and there it was, the staircase leading back to the main floor. Relief surged through me as we bolted up the steps, the dim light of the hallway above growing brighter with each stride. We burst through the basement door, slamming it shut behind us. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing. The hallway was empty, silent except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. "What the hell was that?" Kara gasped, clutching her chest. Tears streaked her face, and her hands trembled as she wiped them away. "I don't know," I said, my voice hollow. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But, Ethan, I couldn't finish the sentence. He was gone. There was no other explanation. The next day, the school was buzzing with rumors. Ethan's disappearance had spread quickly, but no one knew the full story. Kara and I didn't tell anyone what had really happened. Who would believe us? But things weren't the same after that. Kara transferred schools a few weeks later, unable to walk the halls without breaking into tears. I stayed, but I avoided the basement at all costs. One evening, months later, I found myself walking past the stairwell to the basement. I didn't mean to, it was just on my way out of the building. The door was ajar, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard it. The faint hum, low and menacing, drifting up from the darkness below. I didn't look. I didn't stop. I just kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. To this day, I don't know what we found in that room, or what it wanted. All I know is that it's still there, waiting, and sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear Ethan's voice, faint and distorted, calling from somewhere far away. "Help me." It all started on a Friday night. I was part of the debate team, and we had just wrapped up a grueling practice session for an upcoming competition. Most of the school was already empty by the time we finished, long shadows stretching across the hallways as the sun dipped below the horizon. Our school was old, built sometime in the 1940s, with its fair share of quirks and mysteries. The West Wing, for instance, had been closed off for years, deemed structurally unsafe, after a series of repairs were abandoned. Students liked to swap ghost stories about it, claiming they'd heard voices or seen lights flicker in its windows late at night. I never paid much attention to those stories, until that night. I was the last to leave practice, tasked with putting away some equipment in a storage room near the West Wing. The hallway leading there was dimly lit, the bulbs buzzing faintly as I walked. The school's silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. The storage room was just down the hall from the locked doors that led to the abandoned wing. I'd passed those doors dozens of times, always glancing at the dusty "Do Not Enter" sign taped haphazardly across them. But that night, something felt different. As I loaded the last of the equipment onto the shelf, I heard it, a faint thud, like something heavy falling onto the floor. The sound came from the direction of the west wing. I froze, straining to hear more. The sound came again, this time followed by a faint scraping noise, like furniture being dragged across the floor. I peeked out of the storage room, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty, but the noise persisted, echoing faintly through the still air. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn toward the locked doors, my footsteps slow and hesitant. The closer I got, the louder the sounds became. A rhythmic tapping joined the scraping, like someone knocking lightly on a wooden surface. When I reached the doors, I hesitated. Through the dusty window, I could barely make out the dim outlines of the west wing's interior. The hallway beyond was dark and cluttered with broken furniture and debris. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The noises stopped abruptly. For a moment, the silence was deafening, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Then, just as I was about to back away, a faint light flickered to life at the far end of the abandoned hallway. It wasn't bright, more like the soft glow of an old bulb struggling to stay lit. But it was enough to reveal something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, partially obscured by shadows. It wasn't moving, just standing there, its silhouette tall and unnaturally still. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind screamed at me to leave, but something kept me rooted in place. The figure tilted its head, as if it were studying me, and then it moved. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, the faint light casting an eerie shadow along the walls. My breath caught as I realized the locked doors between us wouldn't stop it if it decided to come closer. I turned and bolted back toward the main hall, my heart pounding like a drum. My footsteps echoed wildly as I ran, but behind me, I heard something even more terrifying, the sound of footsteps following. I didn't dare look back. Reaching the main corridor, I skidded to a stop, gasping for air. My eyes darted toward the security desk, hoping to find someone there. But it was empty, just a cluttered desk and a blinking monitor showing grainy footage of the school's hallways. The intercom crackled suddenly, making me jump. The principal's voice, calm and steady, came over the speakers. "Attention staff and students. The school is now under lockdown. This is not a drill." I stared at the intercom in disbelief. A lockdown? At this hour? The lights in the hallway flickered, and a cold draft swept through the corridor. I turned toward the west wing, half expecting to see the figure standing there. But the hallway was empty. I wasn't alone, though. I could feel it, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching me, waiting. The school felt alive in the worst way. Its creaking walls and flickering lights seemed to echo with something watching, something waiting. My breath hitched as I forced myself to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. I needed to find a place to hide or someone who could explain what was happening. The announcement replayed in my mind. The school is now under lockdown. This is not a drill. The west wing's door loomed at the end of the hall, as if daring me to approach. I turned away, heading instead for the library, which was a short distance down the main corridor. It had a solid locking door, and more importantly, a phone I could use to call for help. But as I reached the library entrance, I heard it again. The rhythmic tapping I'd heard earlier. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from behind me. I froze, my hand hovering over the library door handle. Slowly, I turned. The hallway was empty. I swallowed hard, my heart thundering in my chest. Was it my imagination? My nerves? Or was something, or someone, really there? Deciding not to wait and find out, I yanked the library door open and slipped inside, locking it behind me. The familiar scent of books and paper should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The darkness inside the library felt oppressive, the shadows between the rows of shelves deeper than they should have been. I headed for the librarian's desk, fumbling in the dark until my fingers found the phone. I picked it up, relief washing over me, until I realized there was no dial tone. The line was dead. A chill ran down my spine as I set the receiver back on the hook. My eyes scanned the room, trying to shake the sensation of being watched. The rows of books seemed endless, their towering shelves casting jagged shadows in the dim emergency lights. Then I heard it again. The tapping. It was closer now, louder, and coming from somewhere inside the library. My stomach churned as I backed away from the desk, my pulse quickening with each step. Is someone there? I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I took a shaky step toward the center of the library, my sneakers squeaking faintly against the tiled floor. The sound felt deafening in the silence. As I rounded a corner, my flashlight beam landed on something that made my blood turn to ice. A figure was crouched at the far end of the aisle, partially hidden in the shadows. Its limbs were twisted and unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The figure was tapping its long, bony fingers against the floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It stopped when the flashlight hit it. For a long, horrifying moment, we both stayed still, neither of us moving. Then, slowly, it began to rise. I stumbled backward, the beam of the flashlight trembling as it tracked the figure's grotesque, jerky movements. Its face was partially obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. Without thinking, I turned and ran, weaving through the aisles as fast as my legs could carry me. The sound of the tapping grew louder, faster, as if it were chasing me. I burst out of the rows of shelves and sprinted toward the emergency exit at the far side of the library. My hands fumbled with the latch, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. It wouldn't budge. "Come on," I whispered desperately, pulling at the latch with all my strength. Behind me, the tapping stopped. I turned slowly, my back pressed against the door. The library was silent, the shadows still and unmoving. But then I saw it. The figure was standing at the other end of the room, its head tilted toward me. Its elongated arms hung at its sides, and its hollow eyes glinted faintly in the dim light. "Leave," it said, its voice low and guttural. I didn't need to be told twice. Abandoning the emergency exit, I bolted for the main door of the library. My hands shook as I unlocked it and threw it open, stumbling back into the hallway. The oppressive air of the library gave way to the slightly less suffocating silence of the school's corridors. I didn't stop running until I reached the main entrance of the school. I tugged at the front doors, praying they would open, but they were locked tight. The sound of sirens in the distance gave me a glimmer of hope. Turning, I saw the figure standing at the far end of the hallway, its twisted body backlit by the flickering lights. It didn't chase me this time, just stood there, watching. The sirens grew louder, and soon flashing blue and red lights illuminated the front of the school. A loudspeaker blared outside, instructing me to stay where I was. Moments later, officers broke through the front doors, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I collapsed into their arms, barely able to speak. They searched the school from top to bottom, but they found nothing. No figure, no evidence of anyone else being there. The West Wing was locked as tightly as it had always been, and the library was empty. The police assured me it was probably my imagination, a combination of stress and the eerie environment. But I knew better. I never returned to the school after dark again, and I avoided the West Wing altogether. Whatever was in that abandoned hallway wasn't just a story, and I'll never forget the way its hollow eyes seemed to see right through me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. Slow, deliberate, waiting.